Hello and welcome to my podcast. I'm your host, Larry Liu, and today I'm joined by Mike Buhl. So, Mike, welcome to the
Hey,
podcast.
how's it going, Larry?
Doing very well. Yeah, I wanted to first reference that piece that I sent you. I don't think I've read it in its entirety, but it was kind of doing like a social class analysis of the your German political movement that started by Sarah Wagenknecht. She's
Oh
a
yeah, yeah.
former left-wing Die Linke politician in German politics. And she had kind of a few positions that make her quite unpopular with her own political party, the left. Die Linke was very, very popular in East Germany, after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And there was kind of like the People's Party, so to speak, because they were promising, the that East Germany would be integrated into the West, into to the whole of Germany, and that um, you know the economic gap between East and West would be closed. And I think that if you look at the trends over the last 10 years or so, you can see that the support, even in the East, is kind of shifting away from the left. It's going towards the AfD. The
Yeah.
AfD becomes the core party base of East Germany. Um, and and I think that for somebody like Wagenknecht, who herself grew up in East Germany, she thinks that this is, the biggest disaster that could happen for the left. And so she formulates basically, two positions, right? Firstly, regarding the social issues and then economic issues. So on the social issues, she goes very hard on the right. So,
Hmm.
being very much anti-migration, also being very much against, what they call speech censorship, which is kind of like, gender stars, various kind of like cultural left identity issues.
Right.
Um, so being in that way rhetorically socially conservative. And then on the economic policy, she's going very much to the left side, basically trying to increase, whatever the subsidies and welfare programs. And part of this, like economic populism, also is to uh, end the energy sanctions against Russia, because that would lower the gas prices. It would lower the inflation pressure, presumably, and it would require some kind of foreign policy realignment in the direction of Russia and away from the U.S., the NATO framework. Um, and yeah, so this kind of political program that Wagenknecht represents is described by the sociologist Oliver Nachtwey
Oh yeah.
as Bonapartism, right? Um, where
That's a New Left Review, right? The article, New Left
yeah,
Review.
I think
Where,
so, yeah.
yeah.
Um, and I guess Bonaparte, I guess this is the younger one, Napoleon the Third, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, who came to power in France in 1848, and during this, uh, you could say, broader political upheaval that was happening all over Europe. Um, and it was about kind of realizing this bourgeois revolution. And Bonaparte was, one of those people that gained the most popular support, gaining the support of the farmers, the peasantry, right? Kind of like the petite bourgeoisie, right? Like artisans.
Mm.
Um, there was the voter support, and then ultimately, uh, well, he was also backing the big capitalists, and then the people that were opposed to him would be kind of like, you know, like the old feudal lords, kind of that wanted to keep the economic system in the old way, in the traditional way. Um, and Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting analysis. I mean, I didn't read the full article, so I'm not sure the links here between Bonaparte and Wagenknecht, but it's an interesting kind
Well,
of political
well,
attempt.
let me jump in here, if I may. Uh, I think this goes into the issue of that Wagenknecht, may produce a kind of left populism. That she represents this kind of missing energy that the Linke has lost. I mean, there are characters like Klaus Ernst, who had popular support, and sometimes the speech. Some people look at the speech style, how people are able to create resonance, and so I think that this goes into the issue of promoting a kind of left populism. That usually we think of populism, we associate it with the right side of the political spectrum, and the left sort of has lost its roots, its appeal to working class politics. So that's why there's such momentum. There's people think that Wagenknecht will rebuild a mobilization, which is usually you think of it more conservative mobilization. With the farmers tractor protest right now in Germany, uh, trying to get people mobilized. But usually you think of it, it's been more successful on the right, to gain political mobilization and get people voting in, and the left was failed with this often. So I guess that's the appeal. That Wagenknecht, she has this style of how she, uh, gives speeches or goes on TV shows. That somehow that this would be representative of a kind of left wing populism. That's the way I understand. And obviously, there's criticism. There's criticism of journalists that uh, were just maybe people didn't try to mimic what is done on the far right, right? So yeah, that's my
So,
response.
so I did not
You see it
follow
differently. Yeah,
the farmer protest recently. I mean, I assume that they're reacting to some change in government policy, right?
yeah. The diesel subsidies.
It was about
So
cutting the subsidies to farmers, right? That's a big
yeah,
assumption.
so it's very close to the protests they had in France. It's basically, because of this uh, German Constitutional Court invalidated the budget for this year, and one of they are missing 17 million, I think, uh, or billion, 17 billion euros, and the Ampel, the current government, has basically said that they were going to eliminate the subsidy. And so that's where this farmers, tractors, and uprising kind of, they're taking over the streets and they're driving the tractors to Berlin, right? So I don't know, but I don't know where it's going. I don't know if this will, like, there'll be sympathy. Maybe they will just reinstate the subsidy and cancel other programs instead. But I don't know what will happen in Germany. So I'm just watching it like you. I watch the news and I kind of follow it. But whether this helps the Wagenknecht party, I don't know. I don't know if that will actually help that cause. You
Yeah.
know. Yeah.
I mean, the biggest issue I think is regarding, fixing up the budget.
Right.
So I did listen to the interview with the SPD uh, party chair Eskin, who was justifying the government decision. And she was saying that um, prior German governments have done the same thing, right? They have always basically used off-budget means to fund programs like investments that they've found were important. So, the big part of the agenda of the current government is the green energy transition, right? That would involve a significant amount of subsidies. Um, I think that this covers uh, a broad array of programs. For instance, yeah, I mean, helping farmers to remove, I guess, diesel, or it's about subsidizing the heat pump installations because they wanted to get rid of the gas heaters.
Right.
Also, it's about subsidizing the purchase of electric vehicles because they wanted to get rid of combustion engine vehicles. You know, cutting the subsidies on like thermal efficiency in like buildings, um, which they wanted to do to lower heating bills and emissions. And these are, I think, they are all good, reasonable programs, but they do require significant investments. And I think it makes sense to socialize these costs through the government. Basically, make everybody pay for it, and then you can make sure that the poor people would pay less, and the rich people would pay more.
Mhm.
But right now, I mean, it sounds to me like what the government is trying to do to be compliant with the budget law is not to amend the budget law to basically legalize the spending that was previously illegal, but rather it's to cut these programs back.
Yeah.
um
Austerity kind of, yeah.
yeah, it's a
Yeah.
massive austerity program, and um I think my guess is like the FDP finance minister Lindner is probably fine with that,
Yeah.
because he wanted to
Lindner,
do.
yeah. Well,
Yeah,
remember he's from the FTP, so he's, I mean, you're right, the kind of neoliberal market kind of,
yeah, like this
but he's,
Schwarzenegger, right?
but he
The
wants to make it work within the, within the government. So they're going to negotiate. I think they're going to try to work something out.
Yeah, but
So
is it the guy who wants the most amount of change, of course, is Habeck, the economy minister, because he's the guy that basically promised the country that there would be a rapid green energy transition, and that there wouldn't be any costs on you know jobs, basically, or employers. And so it basically involves a massive government subsidy program to facilitate a quick green energy transition.
right.
But it appears to me that these programs are now being uh, cut back, as opposed to like let's change the budget laws to facilitate this kind of spending. Um, and I think that looks incredibly bad on this current government.
Yeah.
And that's the reason why. I mean, if you look at the polling, I think all the three parties get
Lower
yeah, one-third of the
or
support, right? Of the voting support. Um, and it opens a space for CDU, AfD, and perhaps even to
mhm.
the Wagenknecht movement. Uh, yeah, but I mean, like regardless of like who is in charge, I think that I think this the fundamental model in Germany, I think, is quite threatened. I would say, um, because I think there were some of the big German manufacturers, producers that announced plans to shift to overseas locations for the production sites.
Right.
Um, I mean, one statistic that really struck me was about gas energy inflation, which you could say existed everywhere in the world, but it was particularly high in Europe and Asia, because those places are very energy import dependent. Um, versus the US, North America. I mean, we're very dependent on energy for sure because we have a big economy. But most of the energy is domestically sourced, right? So, I mean, down where you are in Texas,
Right.
uh,
Oil and gas.
yeah, big oil and gas fields. We have it up in Pennsylvania. So I mean, there's a lot of locations in Alaska where we have these oil and gas deposits, and that has kept the lid on the energy inflation. Versus on the other hand, I think the U.S. Germany gas contract um, was about, I think, tripling or even quadrupling the energy costs for Germany compared to Russia, compared to the Russian gas. Um, because I mean, but you have to create the infrastructure for, the LNG terminals to basically ship the gas over the Atlantic over tankers. Um,
Mm.
and
Massive project. Yeah.
yeah, but it puts a big question to the German economic model, right? It's like, I mean, you can still have profitable German companies, but they just have more production sites offshore, right? Yeah, they probably go
Car
to,
sector, car factories.
yeah, I
Yeah,
mean, they'd be
definitely.
moving over to the US, for instance, right?
Yeah.
Because over here,
Yeah.
the energy is not an issue at this point. So yeah, so you would have to think really hard in Germany, yeah, about how do you preserve this economic model? Um, because I mean, if you're not able to do that, I mean, then the economy, the output is going to decline, and you're going to have even more fights, even more battles within German society, right? Um,
Definitely. Yeah. And have political consequences. Right. So,
yeah, that's
are you more
it.
pessimistic, I guess, in that sense, than optimistic of the next 10 years when it comes to Germany's economic boom or bust? You think it'd be more pessimistic 10 years from now?
Yeah,
Employment.
I think it's quite pessimistic. I mean,
Okay.
I'm waiting for some good signs to come forward. I think that probably the war has to come to an end, really. Now the complication right now is that, so there's no unity in the West, right? So because in the United States you have basically the Republicans that are connecting the Ukraine aid with border security, right? So they're saying that we're not going to fund Ukraine unless the Democrats want to fund border security, which according to the Republicans, they didn't allocate any funding for the border security, which is the reason why presumably there's an increase in migration and border crossings. Um, and yeah, so and the Democrats don't really want to, allocate more of the border funding. So that's why on this important geopolitical question, there's indecision, right? And in the European side, you have a 15 billion euro aid package for Ukraine that was blocked by Hungary.
Yeah, I
But
follow them.
yeah, so the Hungarian position is basically that they want to remove the rule of law stipulations for the Hungarian EU budget, right? Because the EU has cut the Hungarian budget because basically the EU Commission accuses Hungary, the Hungarian
Yeah,
government, to steal the EU funds, right? To
the
basically,
corruption. Yeah,
yeah, put it into the pockets of the Orban and his cronies.
Well, wasn't it also because of this attack against universities and freedom of academic freedom? Like there was a real kind of attack uh, of academic institutions that were targeted, and then the EU, stepped in to kind of attempt to sanction Hungary for that, for the attacks against academic freedom uh, and shutting down of academic programs. I
Yeah,
think there
for
was a couple
sure.
of
Right. So
Europe, yeah,
you had this one university, which is called Central European University,
yeah,
which is funded by George Soros, who is a you could say hedge fund manager, became philanthropist. And his whole endeavor was to create a university that would train the newly, democratic Central Eastern European countries leaders to, basically take on, liberal democratic norms, right? That was a kind of big assumption. And he wanted to make sure that there would be a campus in Budapest in
yeah,
Hungary, which is his home country. And the early, you know, Hungarian governments were supportive of CEU. And Orban eventually changed his opinion, and he well, he was able to get the other public universities in Hungary pliant to his wish, because these are public universities that get state funding.
yeah,
So basically, all he could do was to appoint new directors to those universities that become more loyal to him. And then those that refuse to budge to his wish would have the funding cut, right?
yeah, or just accredited, right? Would he
Yeah.
be
So
able to give a degrees or something?
yeah. So for CEU, it was different because CEU gets its money from the endowment, right? Which includes investments, throughout Europe and North America. And also from the donations by Soros. So there was no financial tool that the Hungarian government could use to sanction, CEU professors who were speaking out against the Hungarian government, which is the reason why they freely did so. Um, so then what the Hungarian government did was they changed the law on the accreditation, right? So they're basically saying that if it is a university that is Hungarian and a foreign accreditation, it would no longer be able to operate in Hungary. And so after that, the Hungarian campus was closed down, and they had a campus in Vienna in Austria,
Yeah,
and they moved almost all of their operations. I would say 95% of the operations were moved to Vienna at that point. And of course, in Austria, you don't have the restrictions on
right.
academics. Yeah, so ultimately, so yes, so there definitely was a violation of
Academic freedom, yeah.
academic freedom for sure. But I mean,
Yeah,
it's not surprising. I mean, if you look at an authoritarian leader, right? Um, you don't want anybody to say to you that you're a naked emperor, right? Even though you might be, right? You're a naked emperor. And Orban didn't want to be told that. And so the goal of any authoritarian leader is to, you know, increase executive power, to decrease the checks and balances from, other institutions like the judiciary and the parliament, and then also the media and the universities. Um,
very, very anti-intellectual, right?
yeah, it is
Right.
very
And go
anti-intellectual.
after the intellectual class.
Yeah, and the
Um,
interesting thing is that the fact that I spoke to uh, one of my professors who's a Hungary expert, who told me that the situation is a little bit different than even in Russia because a lot of Hungarian academics, the ones who wanted to continue to write critical things, Like they wouldn't be put in jail. I mean, they just wouldn't be able to get a job necessarily, or they would have the contracts canceled. But oftentimes because they're all EU citizens, right? So you have a lot of Hungarians that move to like Austrian or German universities, or other parts of Western Europe, and I have one colleague. He taught for some years in I think in EUI in Florence, a
Mhm.
European University Institute. He's now in Qatar. He was yeah, he used to be, left-wing politician in Hungary, and then he kind of left.
Mm.
So yeah, so that's the thing, right? So if you're a citizen, I mean, yeah, you do have the freedom, right? I mean, you could just move out to another European country. And in that way, actually, it reduces the amount of political pressure and opposition that exists in Hungary, right? And Orban is kind of fine with that, right? He's okay with the intelligentsia leaving, because the economic model is really much more simple, right? I mean, it's basically receiving the EU funds,
Yeah.
because I mean, in terms of like, I mean, currently the way how it works is that if your GDP is significantly lower than the European average, you would probably be getting more funds from the EU. So if you look at it, I mean, I'd say Poland and Hungary are one of the top recipients of EU funds. And those are also the countries that have the most questionable, you know, rule of law framework, you could say. Um, and and there's a couple other considerations for the Hungarian government. I mean, firstly, about opposing Ukraine. Um, so the first concern is that they do want to maintain close relationships with Russia because the Russians are selling cheap gas to Hungary, and they kept those prices lower for Hungary than for the other European countries, because that's what Putin will do to loyal countries, right? That's the first consideration, and then the second consideration is if Ukraine was included in the European Union, which is currently in discussion because of the
Yeah.
status of Ukraine, then the fiscal balance within the EU will shift. Right. I mean, so I mean, countries like Germany and Austria and France, they will continue to pay into the budget, so that they'll probably have to pay a little bit more even. Um, but if you look at a country like Hungary, for instance, I mean, they would probably lose out some of the funds that they would be getting now. And you would have substantial amount of financial aid that will flow to Ukraine because I mean, Ukraine is a
The
significant,
war and all that.
yeah, I mean, it's a significantly poorer country per capita than many of the European countries. They've just been destroyed by the war. So there's a massive amount of, rebuilding needs that
Yeah.
exist in the other European countries.
Schools, infrastructure. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Oh,
it's really a self-serving thing, right? Where Hungary is kind of blocking this EU enlargement. Um,
think they'll succeed, or they'll end up uh, negotiating, or just getting some deal? I mean, hypothetically, could they really stop this process of adding Ukraine to the EU? Or you think there's some legal maneuvering that the EU could do to avoid Hungary being able to veto?
well, I think the decision on the EU has been taken.
Yeah.
So the EU has given the official candidacy status for Ukraine. And in that way, I mean, like, there's still going to be one more ratification round where each country, so after the EU Commission, checks off all of the chapters that Ukraine has to fulfill, um, They would be sent to each of the member state parliaments. So at that point, Hungary still has a veto right.
Yeah.
But regarding the candidacy status, I think that issue has been resolved at this point um, because Orban left the room during
Yeah.
the vote on the candidacy status.
But the process is like 5 years, right? 5, 6, 7 years.
Yeah, it depends. I looked it up. I think
Yeah.
in Croatia it was about 6 years,
Okay.
roughly,
Yeah.
to
Thanks.
from the first chapter, the candidacy status, until the EU Commission was agreeing to all of these points. Um, for Ukraine, this process could potentially take even longer, because you could make the argument that a lot of rule of law frameworks have not been introduced yet by Ukraine. Um, and also the other point would be that I think that while the war is happening, while the territorial integrity has not been reestablished for Ukraine, there might be an ideological unwillingness to conclude the membership negotiations, because ultimately, if the war is still happening, the EU does have a mutual treaty obligation to aid other member states that are being attacked. And so in some senses, I think the decision to give the candidacy status to Ukraine is more about sending the political signal to
Yeah.
Ukraine and to Russia. Uh,
Symbolic, very symbolic.
yeah, absolutely. I mean,
Mm.
more important right now is the money, right? So the 50 billion euros, which Hungary has vetoed. There's going to be a EU summit in February where they will take up the funding issue again. Um, and there's a discussion now among some circles, the higher circles within the EU, to basically block Hungary um, uh, from voting on this EU budget resolution. And I'm not sure whether
We'll
they're going
see.
to do this. Because I mean, because if they decide to suspend those, membership voting rights, so which means that Hungary would remain an EU member, but would not be able to take any decisions within the European Council. Um,
Yeah.
it would be quite a drastic step to take. Um, but I mean, ultimately, it's like you don't get around this issue of strengthening the European Union ultimately. Um, yeah, I mean, imagine if you had like, the US state governments that would start to deliberate over like foreign
Mm.
policy issues, like,
Yeah.
regarding, what's the policy on Ukraine or something like that. I mean, it would be absolutely catastrophic, right? I mean,
Yeah.
um, because, the US would never get anything done. Um,
That's why we have the supremacy clause, right? Right. At the federal level, right? Uh,
yeah, at least the federal
yeah.
policy, I think it absolutely
Yeah.
makes sense. I mean, if you want to have a strong entity that serves the 50 states in the union, and I think the same thing should be applied to the EU. And the French
Yeah.
president Emmanuel Macron has been, he always talks about, ideally, federalizing
Yeah.
um, Europe. Um, but there's not a whole lot of momentum that goes towards such a step of federalization. And of course, this gives, more power to, the US, to Russia, to China, and other geopolitical actors that are much more united. Um,
Mm.
we always hope that during crisis that there would be a bigger
Yeah.
push towards strengthening central institutions. Um, but it's difficult. I mean, you have a lot of centrifugal forces. I mean, you have the big parties like AFD, Le Pen, FPO. I mean, there's a lot of forces that are against strengthening Europe. Um, because they say, oh well, because our nation states, they take better care of our citizens. But the problem is, I mean, if you have big geopolitical issues, right? You have the Ukraine war, you have the refugee crisis, Syria or other places. Um, yeah, whenever you have a major incident like this, you definitely need to have a stronger, centralized geopolitical entity that can, figure things out, for the whole continent.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, so in any case, and that, so okay, so let's make this
Yeah.
presumption that there's no further Ukraine aid that gets passed, right? That the snafu and during the Christmas period, ends up being, you know, the permanent end state.
Or
Uh,
block.
yeah,
Ukraine.
it looks quite tragic in my view because if you look at the battle map, the Russians are now making advances. I mean, they're very small advances, so the Ukrainians are still holding up to some extent. But there's a massive loss of material and man power. There's big losses on the Russian side as well, but you have to consider that the Russian population is much larger, so
Yeah.
much deeper reserves that
Didn't they lose like 200,000 Russian soldiers, something of that nature? Estimates, casualties, 200,000 Russian
yeah,
casualties,
I
and
would even say maybe 300,000.
oh, 300,000. Okay. Wow.
The U.S. intelligence agencies they proclaim that the Russians have lost about 90% of the original troop strength of the invasion army. So when they started in February 22, um, yeah, but those numbers are a little bit simplistic because it's just basically taking the size of the original army and then subtracting the casualties. Because you have to consider the casualties include a lot of the reservists
Mhm.
that are not counted in the original army figure, right? Um,
One question. What's your take on Japan? I read today that Japan gave the go-ahead to, I believe, send their version of Patriot missiles to Ukraine. So the fact that Japan may also enter more into the war. Is that interesting for you? Or I mean, what do you think of Japan is a significant uh, uh, power? I mean, I would never. It's almost like World War II. I'm thinking Japan. I was like, of course, Japan doesn't have a significant army or anything, but they do have weapons. So today, I read that Japan gave the go ahead to send their Patriot missiles to be delivered to Ukraine for their use. They have like licensing or something where they could only uh, previously send it to like the U.S., but now apparently Japan is going to allow uh, Patriot missiles to be used in Ukraine. So I thought, you think that would make any impact whatsoever, or is it insignificant?
yeah, I didn't catch that headline, but I do
Yeah.
know
Okay.
that there's a strategic interest for Japan now to back Ukraine. So firstly, there's been a Russian-Japanese border dispute that's been going on since World War II, where you have the Sakhalin Islands, um, which is in north of Japan. So you have an island chain north of Japan that was controlled by Japan during the imperial era until 1945, and the Russians basically seized it, annexed it effectively, and that's like kind of like a sore dispute that exists between Japan and Russia, and so I think the fact that the Japanese are now more actively engaged in this conflict suggests that they definitely try to counter um, the Russian influence. If you look at South Korea, for instance, has in the recent past, I would say the past half year, they've been the biggest artillery supplier to the Ukrainian army, largely because the Americans and the Europeans have sent the stockpile that they designated for the Ukraine conflict. So the Koreans are major producers, South Koreans.
Yeah,
And that was in response also to the North Koreans, because the North Koreans supply the Russian army.
right.
And so, as a response to that, the South Korean government in turn increased their shipments of artillery to Ukraine. So clearly, I mean, we do have a global the Stellvertreter Krieg, right? So it's a proxy war, basically,
Yeah.
um, where I
Like
mean,
a like would you call it a new Cold War? I don't mean to interrupt you. Like a new kind of Cold War.
yeah, yeah, because
Yeah,
there's more detail, which is China, right? So
yeah,
the Chinese, they have not sent like heavy tanks or heavy armor like airplanes and things like that, but they did send a lot of spare parts that could be used for those kinds of equipment in the Russian army. They have supplied a lot of drones now. So a lot of the drones actually have Chinese writings on it. They're used by Russia. Um, like dual use goods like semiconductors, chips that are essential for military technologies, like missiles, rockets, and things like that. So the Chinese are definitely backing the Russian side. So clearly, I mean, and within the Asia Pacific theater, I think that the hottest conflict is basically between China and most of the other countries in the Asia Pacific region. Um, so Japan, um, South Korea, maybe the Philippines, Australia.
right.
They're trying to create this kind of coalition that would basically um, contain the Chinese influence.
Mhm.
So in that sense, I mean, I think that if you have a proxy conflict, the East Asians, I think they increasingly feel like they have to contribute to this Eastern European conflict. Um, uh, and yeah, it's basically, I mean, so it's only the global South countries that are like completely on the sideline, right? I mean, if you look at countries like India, for instance, if you look at
Brazil. Yeah,
yeah, Brazil, yeah, sub-Saharan Africa, right? There's a lot of places that are sitting it out. I mean, they're saying, well, I mean, first of all, I mean, even if they did take a side in the conflict, it wouldn't really matter because they just lack, significant resources to sustain such a long war. And then they're probably then not interested in fighting this kind of war,
yeah,
right? Um, so yeah, it's a complicated game of like political realignment. And so in any case, if uh, if Ukraine ends up being on the losing side of this conflict, I think it would be you know quite catastrophic. Now it's a big question whether Russia will continue to keep going further west. I think Moldova would definitely be in the sights.
you think Lithuania might be a target?
Yeah, I mean
Baltics?
the Baltic states. I mean the German army just decided to
Yeah,
station
that's
another
true.
brigade in
Lithuania.
Lithuania. And I hope it's gonna be the deterrent. But you never know. I mean, so if we assume that, so if Putin was a perfectly rational figure, I mean, he would basically stop at Ukraine, right?
Yeah, but he's not. Right. He seems more Machiavellian. I don't know. He's kind of my my interpretation is very Machiavellian, kind of power oriented survival, you know, dictator wants to survive kind of mentality. So
Yes, yes,
you
and
know,
that that's and the important assumption is that the country, which is basically, I mean, if we think about it, I mean, the name of Russia is actually a Russian Federation, right? A Rossiyska Federacja, I think.
mhm,
Um, so it's basically a federation of republics, and I don't know how many republics. I think there's more than 100, maybe
many.
republics inside of the Russian Federation, right? And the idea effectively is that if you wanted to keep the power in Moscow, right, in the Kremlin, you basically have to fight continuous wars. Um, if you think about it, I mean, so Russia started off as the Muscovy Principate. Um, I would say in the around 1500s, I want to say, and in basically in Moscow and the surroundings, and it gradually, probably by kind of like the early 19th century, I want to say, it took the form that it is about today. So you could imagine an expanse of over 300 years, Russia kept on expanding territorially, right? Um, which I mean, obviously, like if you go into like deep into Siberia, I mean, you can see why it's so easy to conquer the place, because it's basically like an ice desert, right? With maybe like needle trees and yeah, but very importantly, like very low population density, right? Very low settlement. Um, and then like the few indigenous people that would live there, you could just basically enslave and kill them, which is kind of what colonial powers do. Um, and that's kind of over 300 years of that history of how Russia came to be. Um, and so actually, at the peak of its power, which was the Soviet period, much of the 20th century, I guess, was
Mhm.
actually a very extraordinary period because at that point the Soviet Union didn't expand significantly. So after the gains in 45, right, which includes then East Germany and Poland, whose territorial boundaries shifted westward, right? Then Belarus and Ukraine as part of the Soviet Federation. They also expanded the territory further west. Um, once that happened, so there was a consolidation of territorial expanse for the Soviet Union, and they didn't go on further conquest. I mean, there was an intervention in Afghanistan, which ultimately destroyed it in the 80s.
Yeah.
But yeah, there was not like a you know big drive to its further conquest, really. Maybe they were interested in doing so, but maybe they were not. Um, you know, they didn't see the openings there. And uh, and it looks like, I mean, after the turmoil of the 90s under Yeltsin,
Mm.
who was like this big fat, always drunk, and certainly incapable of ruling really. Um, I think with the rise of Putin, I mean, effectively, I mean, what he was trying to say and communicate to the Russian public was that he would restore the same kind of glory that abruptly ended with Tsar Nicholas II dethronement at the end of World War One.
So he wants to go back to the czar image of conquest
Yeah,
again,
yes, yeah,
like
yeah. I mean,
being
and
the czar.
with the same idea of like basically autocratic rule on the inside, and then permanent war of expansion on the outside.
Deeply, deeply nationalistic, I guess, right?
Yeah,
Very,
I mean it's nationalism and it's war, right?
yeah.
And those are the tools that are kind of fused together. I mean, that's why I very much enjoyed the Napoleon movie that was recently brought out.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, because it was very well done. I mean, obviously, like, it's a 3 hour movie. I mean, you have to select the historical episodes that the director wants to tell, right? Um,
Mhm.
so I think they showed th well, kind of like three battles, right? The Battle of Austerlitz, Battle of Moscow, and Waterloo. Um, but I mean, like the important, almost psychological feature, right? So if you wanted to do a psychogram of somebody like Napoleon, right, where he was like, "I'm going to bring glory to the tricolor," which is the French flag, and this idea of nationhood, right? So that's why I mean a lot of countries they still use the Code Napoleon, right?
Mhm.
Which is the legal framework, which is an alternative to the British common law framework, right? So if you look, I mean, a lot of Latin American countries, a lot of European countries adopted the Code Napoleon, right? Which was named really after Napoleon Bonaparte, right? So there's a major legacy that Napoleon had for the continent, for the world. Um, but in his way of thinking, he thought that the French empire would be held together by foreign conquest, right? By playing off the Prussians and the Austrians and the Russians and the British, and then gradually capturing more and more territory. And then it was only when his army was destroyed in Russia, um, that his fortune was basically wiped out.
Yeah.
But
Mhm.
it's really this kind of this acquisitive, aggressive, militarily aggressive um, kernel of I suppose self-legitimation that characterized figures like Napoleon, like Peter the Great, um, and like Putin. I mean, Putin thinks that the not Napoleon, but it was Peter the Great. Peter the Great, who won a decisive battle against the Swedes, the Swedish Empire, I think, which was defeated under I think it was the Battle of Poltava. It was
Mhm. I think
17.
so. I think you're right. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and after the Swedish defeat, I mean, the Swedes were kind of dominant in Finland and the Baltic states, sometimes even in like Denmark, northern Germany, right? Um, and um, and they were kind of, you know, was once they were defeated by the Russians, I think the Swedish imperial ambitions basically died at that point. Um, and
Mhm.
Yeah, so and so this was kind of the high point, and the fact that Putin picks Peter the Great is also interesting because Peter ultimately believed in the fact in the idea that Russia is a great power within Europe, right? And he would. That's why Saint Petersburg, right? Saint Petersburg would be named after him. And Putin himself came from Saint Petersburg, which when he was born it was called Leningrad. Um, but yeah, he sort of has the same idea of like, I'm really a European power, and this European power would have to project further west. Yeah, which of course it can do in Belarus, which is a Russian satellite state.
Yeah.
Um,
To this day, right?
yeah,
Pretty much,
yeah. I mean,
more or less.
Lukashenko is basically I mean, he's a powerful Russian province governor, really,
Yeah.
more powerful than the other the other governors in the Russian Federation. Um, but not much more, not much more than that. Um, and he wanted to have the same structure in Ukraine. I mean, look, I mean, like, I think ultimately, like, he doesn't care, like, if, if Ukrainian language, Ukrainian culture still exists. I mean, he's probably fine with that, right? Um, but he just wants to make sure that, that there would be a pliant figure in Kiev, right? Like somebody like Viktor Yanukovych, right?
Mhm.
Uh,
Pro-Russian kind of, right?
yeah, that's right. I mean, basically, like a Russian vassal state, effectively.
Let me ask you maybe a sociological question. I'm very much a fan, I'm sure like you are, of Max Weber's theory of charismatic legitimacy and Weber's theory of charismatic domination and also charismatic mobilization. But what strikes me with Weber's original theory was focused very much on persons, and like you can think of Napoleon, Bonaparte. You could think of Peter the Great, or even evil people like Stalin or Hitler. But Weber's, I think, original theory was focused more on this personality and this charisma that people had, which created appeal and resonance. I guess my question is to you, do you think that, like in some of these cases, historical cases of Napoleon becoming successful, that it's also about the opportunity structures and the geopolitical things that make it possible for leaders to emerge? Or do you think it also is a little bit of a grain of, personality? There's something there too. I mean, that you have to have these strong figures that are able to mobilize so many people, uh, that it's a combination of both. Or you think, what could have, I mean, even in modern day society, people still kind of fight over this. Is it the people that are able to mobilize, or is it the circumstances, the situation, that creates the opportunity for people to take advantage of it? It could be positive or negative, but uh, I don't know. It's a long question, but I figured I ask you. But because I think there's still merit in Weber's theory of charisma, because it focuses on the individual qualities. But I also think that there's some opportunity structures or something that has to happen in the structure of societies that enables individuals to become successful or mobilize or become heroes or whatever. That makes sense.
Yeah.
I
So
hope.
the practical answer is, I think there's always a little bit of both, right? So you have the social environment, right, that is favorable to social change, and then you have, at the right time, you have the charismatic leader that pops up. So if you look at like Hitler's biography, for instance, right? Um, he was a failed artist from I think Upper Austria, right, Oberösterreich, from Braunau, and in his late teens, early 20s, and he moved to Vienna, where he tried to enter the art school, which was led by a Jewish director, and he was rejected. And I think that's the source. I think that's fundamentally the source of his,
So
anti-Semitic
anti-Semitism. Yeah.
ideology. Well, I mean, so at that time, I mean, so there was a lot of anti-Semitism throughout Europe, but also in Vienna. The mayor, Karl Lueger, he was a famous anti-Semite. Um, and so, he wasn't inventing anti-Semitism at all, but I think that was the formative experience for him. The trauma that basically made him project all of his aggression against Jews. And yeah, but he wouldn't have done anything with that kind of resentment, right? Which at that time was quite common. Um, Really, this itinerant lifestyle did not end until World War One. So when World War One started, he then moved to Bavaria in southeast Germany. Then was conscripted, or actually signed up for the German army, and he fought in France in World War One. And he was not like a superbly athletic figure or capable soldier in any sense, but it is reported that it was during his engagement in the war, right, fighting on the Western Front, that he, for the first time in his life, he felt real purpose, right? And then, of course, the German army was defeated. The Armistice Treaty, Treaty of Versailles, um, was signed, and then he sort of joined kind of like this Bierkellerpolitik, right, which is kind of like the famous beer sellers and
Munich.
in Bavaria, right?
Yeah.
Where um,
Stammtisch.
the Stammtisch, exactly, yeah,
And they
where
talk politics on the while drinking beer.
drinking
They still
politics,
do
yeah,
that, by the way.
drinking beer, talking politics, right? And so it
Austria
was,
too, I think.
yeah,
Yeah.
and so it was in one of those events that he developed these like oratory skills, right? Well, basically he started to scream, right? And then, but he did it in a way that was, I mean, it would be off-putting. Like if you're like a very well-educated person, right? I think you kind of like, well, what did this guy drink, right?
Mhm.
But I think if you're sort of like an ordinary person, I think you're kind of like, you're attracted to that, right? You're like, okay, this guy makes sense, and it's like, yeah, there's something wrong with the status quo. Everybody knows it. And
Mhm.
he was railing against the Treaty of Versailles, being German humiliation, and all of these other things. And but it's important that it was the army network, right? So it was the Bavarian regiment, that the army unit that he served in during World War One. They were the ones who kept pulling him, into the Stammtisch, and basically give these tirade speeches. Um, and and then of course he organized this big march in to overthrow the regional government in Munich, where he was then imprisoned, and then he wrote Mein Kampf in prison. Um, and at that
The
time, I
rest is
mean,
history, right? The rest is history,
yeah,
I guess.
so for sure, yeah, absolutely. But yeah, so the key event I would say, is World War One. I mean, without that, I think that you know maybe he would have become. I mean, he would have stayed a hobo in Vienna, and he might have died somewhere in the streets of Vienna or something, right? He might have taken like a working class job, and he would have stayed at that level, right? Um, but yeah, yeah. So it was the political circumstances really that gave him the opening. I mean, you have to consider. I mean, the Nazi Party was at 5% in 1928,
Mhm.
and it went to 33% in 1932, right? So
Do you
yeah.
do you think this is a combination appeal of both a kind of hyper militarism and what we can just say fascism? They kind of converge together. That I mean, the same thing in an Italian case, with Italian fascism and Mussolini, there was this thrive of just militarism, nationalism, and authoritarian, anti-democratic kind of politics. A lot of these movements were very anti-democratic, and they were just militaristic in the way they dress, the way they talked, the way they performed. So, I don't know, that's my thesis. I don't know. It's kind of and this was unchecked. I mean, there was the Weimar Republic, had difficulty in stopping this extremism, and they, uh, you know, So uh, yeah, so that, I think that expands Weber's theory of charisma, if you think about it, because it he was writing at a different time, but he didn't, he never got to see fascism and all this. But I wonder what Weber would have said with his theory of charisma when it came to fascism, the rise of fascism, especially in Europe at that time. So
Yeah, so you need charisma in
yeah.
order to be a successful fascist, right? So, and I'd say it certainly helps, right? I mean, ultimately, so if you go back to the root word fasces, right, which is like a bundle of sticks, right, that are held together, you know, and then the question is, well, what holds those sticks together, right? So the sticks are basically the people, right? The fascist supporters. The fascist supporters are very important, right? But what ultimately holds it together historically, we know, was the charismatic leader, right? So you had this one person who was able to give a speech, and was able to mesmerize the masses, and the people would be flocking towards that leader. Um,
Mhm,
and so fascism historically has always thrived with an autocratic leader.
mhm,
Um, and I think that this kind of Durkheimian analysis that Hannah Arendt provided, the origins of totalitarianism, right?
mhm,
Which is basically like really playing with this concept of enemy, right?
yeah.
Of like the lack of norms, the lack of like social values that bind everybody together, right? And in modern society, you don't really have those ties. You don't have those links anymore. Because to some extent, I mean, being deeply rooted, embedded into a community, right? That's so important to our existence as people. So, as hunter-gatherers, it would usually be the family, the immediate tribe. Within farming communities, you would have the village. You would have your own family, of course. Um, and those structures, right? Both the hunter as well as the farmer. I mean, they provided a very stable social framework in which people could thrive. Uh,
Gemeinschaft, right?
it is the Gemeinschaft.
Early,
Toners call it
early
Gemeinschaft.
Gemeinschaft. Well,
And
yeah.
and basically, the more developed you are on a trajectory of towards Gesellschaft, towards the fully formed society, um, the the less of a common narrative that you have, and the less stability, security you have. I mean, within the society, you can have the thriving segments of that population, right? Like think of like tenured professors, or think of engineers and data scientists, and like kind of a professional class. Um, those are the people that, even though they live in Gesellschaft, right, they don't have the overarching, social norms that bind everybody together, but they have kind of still like a local community, right?
Yeah.
Usually the workplace, or like the family, friends, and so forth. And of course, having friends. I mean, it does presuppose, at least in our capitalist society, it requires some money, right? Because you want to go out and eat and go to the movie with your friends and stuff. So it does require some resources. Um, and yeah, and those middle classes, I think they are not so uh receptive to fascism, right? So I mean, even if you look at U.S. society, right? I mean, if you do like an in-depth like political survey, you would find that I think the same percentage of people are hating Trump, right? I would say about 60% roughly.
Mhm.
Which not everybody's doing well economically, but but there's still a substantial portion within the population, generally a little bit better off, definitely more on the left wing culturally, and they're absolutely appalled by the Trump phenomenon, and still are. And they were in the beginning, they still are. Um, and but then again, you have a part of the community that where where you could say the Gesellschaft norm is extraordinarily weak, right?
Mhm.
Where there's an incredible amount of economic insecurity, I would say. Um, and I think there was this one study, I think that was about trying to identify the social class background of the
Mhm.
January 6th, rioters. Um, and it's interesting, actually. I mean, so there were people from the middle class. I mean, like this kind of like petite bourgeoisie, like people
Yeah.
that are like small business owners, um, something like lower middle class people. So they were not at the very bottom of the hierarchy, right? So they were not like homeless people, right?
Right.
But they were sort of, yeah, this lower middle class layer that basically was afraid about the future, right? So they were thinking that, whatever the democratic and the cultural left policies are the ones that are destroying them, right? That are destroying the small businesses. And if you think back of like Marx's essay of like 19th century France,
Mhm.
where he does describe that, that eventually the petite bourgeoisie could join the proletarian ranks, and in that way they would oppose the capitalist class towards this working class revolution.
Right.
Um, and yeah, so even Marx described documented that there was a vulnerable layer within the population, not at the very bottom, but kind of like lower middle class.
Yeah. That could be
And
allied to the proletarian,
well, I mean,
or sell out to the bourgeoisie, right?
yeah, I mean, or they would put the support behind an authoritarian leader ultimately.
Yeah.
Because the idea effectively is that also, if you think about the quality of the political discourse that we have in many Western countries, right, but especially in the US, um, I would say that the quality of discourse keeps going down, right, over the years. Some of it, I think, it does have to do with social media as a communication tool, like amplifying like the most crazy voices on the left and the right.
Mhm.
Um, but if the quality of the discourse goes down, the acrimony between the political camps is increasing, and that means also that the trust in the political system is declining. And so, and as the trust is declining, you also find that this political paralysis keeps getting worse, right?
Yeah.
Because
Almost dysfunctional, almost. You
yeah,
know.
because because kind of like the right wing people, I mean, they will rally around like the
Yeah.
MAGA faction, right? So they have MAGA people in Congress. The Democrats, like the progressive activists, they want to have the more progressive candidates, right, in office. And and then you have the potential blockage point. So in this case, because the Democrats are in the White House right now, so you have the block. So the progressives, I think they're okay at this point. But the blockage point is going to be the MAGA Republicans, right? They are basically abusing the
Yeah.
process to, block Ukraine aid and things like that, right? Blocking important political decisions. Um,
Budget, definitely.
yeah, so and
Probably a budget fight again.
yeah, and then so the thing is, I mean, the more dysfunctional the political system becomes, um, the more the people want to have the Führer, right?
Mhm.
They want to have the leader that will fix things for them. Because I mean, because it's a fair argument, right? Because I mean, you're like, well, okay, ideally everybody wants democracy, right? If you have like this, if you envision this kind of a great system to live under, right? Where, one man, one vote, that sort of thing. But assuming if you have a small d democratic system and you have complete political paralysis, such that important decisions that need to be taken for the benefit of the people, those decisions are no longer made. Um, then the people that want to have the the charismatic leader to
To
fix,
solve this divisiveness. Yeah.
yes, to
Yeah.
fix it for them.
Isn't it like characteristic of, I guess you can say, what, Carl Schmitt, he used to talk about this politics is just about creating an enemy and friends scheme. And in the US, this is amplified, that it's become so polarized that all politics is just fixated on these battles between who's viewed as the enemy and who's the friend, and it creates this kind of seeking of a person or individual that can solve this polarization. Yeah, that's the way I understood it. And it's excessive polarization, and that becomes politics in itself. It doesn't even, whatever faction someone belongs to, that people are so fixated on creating these polarized notions of political difference. Blue state, red state. I mean, it's even in our language, I guess. Rural, urban, that becomes that is politics in the U.S. almost, right?
Yeah,
Sadly.
yeah. I
And
mean,
so, yeah, like
if
you're
you see,
saying, it creates an urge to vote. People then vote bizarre candidates, right? In Germany too, by the way. I mean, I don't know. They had this case, first case, I think, of the AFD mayor being elected a week ago. First time an AFD mayor was elected, because right now they have uh, Bundestag Abgeordnete, but they never had a mayor elected. So first time. And remember, this is a very extreme right wing party. So uh, yeah, we'll see what
yeah, so
happens.
they're doing quite well at this point for sure. But yeah, I mean, generally, yeah, the right wing political forces. I mean, they always seem to have it easier than the left wing. Um, Ultimately, I think one of the main reasons for that is that, like Lenin, he had this idea of the vanguard, right? So the
Mhm.
intellectuals, they would take over the Communist Party, and then they would lead the working class, and they would lead the peasants. At that time, mostly people were peasants, into this like communist paradise, right? Um,
Mhm.
and it's only that kind of, you know, like what they call democratic centralism, which is an oxymoron, right? Because I mean, really, it is mostly centralism and not a lot of democracy.
Mhm.
Um, that that you can have viable communistic regimes, right? Like left-wing regimes. But ultimately, I think that a lot of people that come from the left, right? That's kind of not where our heart is, right? If you come from the political left, your heart is on the side of, the underdog, democracy, and kind of like,
Union.
yeah, equalizing things. And then you're going to have an issue because so the people that are most likely to be left wing, I mean, I think the biggest predictive variable for being left wing is level of education, right? So I mean, if you look at our level, I mean, like we're PhDs, right? I think at our level, I would say 80-20 is
Okay.
like liberal versus conservative, right? And
Depending
so
on the discipline, though, I guess.
yeah, yeah, that's true, that's true.
Okay. Yeah.
But generally, yeah, I think like engineering, I think is more balanced. But certainly social science, liberal arts is more on the left. Um, and so and so, okay, so well, okay, it could be a good thing and a bad thing. I mean, you could say it's a good thing because, um, you know, we would be able to run the country if you just vote for us, because we're experts, we study things, we are empiricists, we're practical people, blah blah blah.
Mhm.
Um, but then also it could make things more complicated because, like, if you ever go to an academic seminar, right, you have 10 people and you have 20 opinions, right? And that's normal for us, right? Because it's,
Yeah.
well, I read this text and I understand it to mean this, and then another
Debating
person
culture.
goes,
Yeah.
yeah,
Debating culture. Yeah. Real
debate,
debating kind of.
yeah, which
Yeah.
is great in a seminar environment. I mean, you want to encourage diversity of thought in a seminar environment. But in politics, I mean, it's different. It's a different kind of principle, right? I think in politics, it's two things basically. It's ideology and power, right? So you need to have an ideology so that so that the program that you want to advocate for, and you need to obtain the power so that you can implement your ideology, right? Now, the right wing, I think they understand it really well. I mean, so you mentioned it, the verb, I think the adjective Machiavellian, right?
Yeah.
And so which is basically about an awareness of the principles of obtaining and
Oh.
maintaining political power. Yeah, so it's about obtaining it and wielding it and keeping it. And so this requires kind of a laser focus, which I think in the left we have a very hard time with that. Because in
Mhm.
the left, I mean, you know, we have this issue about defining what is a good society.
It's more ideals oriented, I guess. Equality focus and
Yeah, yeah, but not only that, but it is there's so many ways how to get to that ideal, right?
mm,
And we get stuck at that level, right? We get stuck at this making this tactical decision. Whereas I think
yeah.
on the right, it's much easier, right? So on the right, you have two choices, right? You can either say, I want the status quo, and I'll hold on to it as much as I can, or you go status quo ante, right? Which means that you go to an era that used to exist, no longer exists. I mean, if you remember the
Mm,
podcast with Richard David Precht,
yeah.
describes the AFD party as wanting to go back to the 1950s in Germany.
Yeah.
So really about kind of like idealizing a past
It's
uh,
gone by.
that no longer exists. But
Sort of a proletarian conservatism, I guess. Deep or some kind of an image of the past that's utopian, conservative oriented kind of. Yeah.
yeah, but the important thing is that it doesn't take too much convincing effort
That's
to these AFD supporters to describe precisely what the 1950s entails. There might still be some elderly grandparents that are alive that might remember those times, right? And even for the younger people, I mean, they can just read the history books and they can, trace back precisely what was so good about those good old times, supposedly. Um, and the left wing has a much harder time, right? I mean, the Green Party in Germany, I mean, is absolutely vilified for why? Because they try to go on this energy transition, right, at a very rapid pace, because they think that there's a massive urgency because of
Sure.
the
Yeah.
rapidly rising temperatures, right? That you have to put the foot on the gas pedal to get rid of the gas engine, so to speak. Um, and yeah, so basically, the Green Party, they're trying to sell a vision that is very progressive, that I think you and I could get behind because we
Mhm.
understand, at least
Urgency,
yeah, I mean,
necessity
we
to
we
do something.
understand the basics of the science, of the climate science, without being climate scientists, but we understand the basics of it. Um, but for the general population, I think that they're kind of like, what is this Green Party trying to sell us? Um, and they're going too fast, basically. And so yeah, so then it becomes much harder to convince the public to go along. Um, and so that's why I think the left has the significant disadvantage to uh, get their um,
Agenda.
to get their agenda going for sure. Um, yeah, so there's like squabbles within the left, like the intellectuals among the left, and then there's also the inability to convince the public. Right?
Larry, do you think that the culture wars and the way culture wars, I guess the topics that resonate often in political discourse that favors the right, is that a fair claim that it does not favor the left? That most culture war topics or debates, they're often centralized on topics that generally favors the right side of the political spectrum. What I mean here is like immigration, abortion, that these tend to favor the right side, and the left has a hard time when it comes to culture war debates in succeeding. I don't know, politically, they're not able to just find the same political support, or somehow the right uh, tends to win on culture war topics or succeeds. That it's just something that favors the right, not the left. Is that a fair assessment? Especially in the US. If you think of the central culture war debates, like immigration, abortion, for example, but those topics all tend to always favor the right side when it comes to outcome,
Yeah, I
especially
would say
election outcome.
right now it is like that. I mean, if you look at the numbers of border apprehensions, it has gone up substantially. Now the pandemic has come to an end, I think people are wanting to come in. Um, and and then there's a very difficult uh case now for like a city like New York City, right? So New York City was and a bunch of other northern liberal cities declared themselves to be sanctuary cities. It was during the Trump administration, when those cities were trying to signal to the voters that they're still open-minded to its immigration, while the Trump administration was anti-immigration. Um, and I think this, and then what happened? So when then Biden came in, and the border apprehensions are starting to increase, and you have these border states and the conservative states, so Texas, but I think in Arizona they're doing this now. In Florida they've been doing it, where they are sending them on one-way ticket buses to New York City
Mhm.
to
Yeah.
basically challenge this idea of sanctuary city. And now even the mayor of New York City Eric Adams. I mean, if you listen to his speeches, I mean, um, while he's still trying to play it both ways, right? He's saying that we want to provide minimum standard of care to migrants who are coming in, but at the same time, he's saying that we're overwhelmed, that we can no longer take any migrants, um, and that you know that we have to starve city resources in order to accommodate these migrants. And that's a position that he also doesn't want. So effectively, I mean, he is in all but name, he has to give up the sanctuary city principle. The city is just not able to cope with that.
Mm.
And then and then those, Democratic mayors, I mean, they're in deep moral trouble because either they say, we're going to have to shut the border, but in which case they clearly are not sanctuary cities, in which case they're just like NIMBYs, right? Not in my backyard, right? Where they're saying, well, okay, you Texas in the border state, you deal with the problem. Which I mean, I don't think that the Democratic politicians in the North are saying that explicitly like that. So either that, so they have to be anti-migrant and they have to join the right-wing cause, which some mayors in the North are doing. Or they have to be hypocrites, right? Where they're saying, well, we're still pro-migrant, um, but we don't, but we really push out these migrants. We can't really take them. Or
Mm.
the third option is we keep taking these migrants and we're just going to be overwhelmed.
Mm.
The social order will crumble ultimately, right? Because I read somewhere
So,
that they cut the library budget, for instance, right?
mm. So it's a lose-lose situations for Democratic governors either way. I mean, if they do something, they're damned. If they don't do anything, they're damned. It's one of those lose-lose kind of scenarios. What's interesting, another note in Dallas, the Dallas mayor, I think this happened 2 months ago, switched political parties. He wasn't identified as Democratic and he went Republican. So sometimes, you know, mayor politics is quite interesting in the US.
And what was it
Political
about
people,
immigration policy?
uh, he I don't remember the details, but he basically switched political parties on the claim that Democratic Party was no longer appealing to him, and he felt more represented in the Republican Party. But this happened in Dallas, which is a major, Democratic stronghold here in Texas. So, which is interesting, like it's uh, mayor politics doesn't always quite align with state politics at a state level, like
And then
governorships.
that jives with like this anti-panhandling uh, practices that are being introduced in
Which,
Dallas.
uh, that's another interesting topic. Thanks for bringing that up. That topic. The Dallas City Council has been, they did pass an ordinance which makes it illegal to stand in certain areas. So yeah, they have been kind of going after issues like this, panhandling, for instance. Um, but yeah, but there's other states, other cities that have different kinds of ordinances towards panhandling. But yeah, good that you brought that up. I've
So the
found this,
policy is to prevent panhandling,
yeah,
to discourage it.
officially it's under the Office of Homeless Solutions in the city of Dallas, which has created what they call a panhandling deflection program, where they have like city officials, staff that take record statistics and they look at the hot spots, locations where panhandling happens the most. Then they have either staff members of police go out and contact individuals, inform them of the ordinance, but also signage. There's a lot of signage that's created. I mean, basically what the city does, they start putting up signs everywhere, discouraging panhandling. A lot of major cities actually have done this now. Like there's a lot of cities that just put up signs that say, don't give money to panhandling. There's also different attempts to create barriers. so people can't stand in certain areas. Uh, so yeah, it's a big topic, big issue, and obviously there's people very much divided on it. Some people think it's criminalizing the poor. Others think, it's necessary to discourage underground economy, things like that. So, but yeah, it's a interesting topic, definitely. I don't know how it is in Baltimore or with panhandling or how it's approached or tolerated. Curious. Is there
Um,
any law against it where you live
I'm not
or?
sure there's a law specifically about it.
Okay.
It definitely does exist. And so when I used to go to UPenn during my undergraduate years, I used to take the subway every day, and you would see a panhandler every day, I would say. I mean, in the subway, and they would always go between the wagons back and forth. Um, and some of them give like longer speeches, but um, many of them are just just begging for the money, I guess. And Yeah, there wasn't really much of a policy um to do anything about it.
So it was tolerated, I guess, pretty much.
Yeah, it was kind of
Yeah.
tolerated more or less.
Okay. Yeah. I,
And
I've been kind of theorizing a little bit on this. I don't know if you're familiar with Merton's strain theory. It's a classic. So with panhandling, I think there's different types of uh, how do you say, reasons or motivations. Some of it may be psychological. I mean, there's some psychological reasons. I guess social exchange theory comes to mind. People receive a reward, and when they stand outside with a sign, and then they may do it again, right? So there's like the social exchange aspect. But as a sociologist, I kind of reject this pure psychological motivations. So I think, like, theoretically there's different types of panhandling where it may be, like you said, deprivation based reasons. People are deprived, absolute poverty, and that's the last solution. You beg uh, for money on the street with a sign. I have observed that a lot, um, even in places where I teach. That does exist. It is, you can see often maybe homeless people, even with their wagon or something, they have a sign. But I think there's two more types. Another one I call alternative income reasons. Maybe some people are not like totally deprived, but maybe they just do it for additional income, you know? So yeah, that also probably happens. There's some people that may engage in panhandling, perhaps because this is an additional source of income. And the third I was thinking of is alternative activity. And I actually observed this personally once. I was like eating in a kind of mini restaurant inside a gas station, and very close there was a location where panhandlers will go out in the corner of the city to just wait where the lights turn. Okay, I actually did observe an individual that would collect the money and then go into the gas station to like use it to play kind of like gambling machines, I guess, and then would go back out. And so sometimes people may use it, I guess, as a different way of consuming their time, different activity. I mean, they may not necessarily do it just for money reasons, but maybe sometimes people are desperate, and they don't have anything else to do, and then they decide to engage in panhandling. I know it's bizarre, but so that's my three theories, I guess, that you can kind of say. I think, yeah, some of it may be deprivation based, reasons why people engage in panhandling. Others, it may be alternative income source that they're just acquiring some alternative income, right? Uh, and what was the third one? The third one said just recreational or doing something different with their time. That's my hypothesis. No, of course I got to do more investigation, but that's my original uh, theory. It fits actually really well together with Randall Collins' interaction ritual chains. You know, there's some kinds of panhandling that's just symbolic in nature, and perhaps people are, you know, communicating in the street, and they may have a sign, but it may be something where they're interacting with car passengers or people that are just happen to be in that place, and they may not make any money. I mean, it could be that you would stand out there the whole day and not make a dollar, right? That could definitely happen. So, so that's my little contribution. Uh, Especially here in Dallas. I mean, there's lots of discussions about panhandling and, you know, or now one solution that I have proposed several times in my class, I was like discussing this with students. I was like, how about basic income guarantee, you know, as candidates, potential candidates, because people are always talking about who would be candidates for a basic income guarantee. And I was thinking, well, that this could be perhaps perfect candidates, you know, to test a basic income program at the city level. You know, what will happen to people that are panhandling if they were giving cash dividends or cash grants, and if they would follow their money? You know, there's a way to do that. I don't know. What's your thoughts on that? At a city level, would
Yeah,
that be
so I
risky?
don't think that we need any more basic income trials, and I'm really
Okay,
basing this opinion on
okay.
Evelyn Forget. She's one of those foremost experts, Canadian, on basic income. Um, and because nowadays, because you see so many trials that are done on basic income, and I think the reason is not so much because of funders trying to find out the you could say labor market responses or
Mhm,
the way how the recipients are going to use the money. I think it's really because they they don't want to put too much money into this program, and they really want to encourage the government to pick up the tab, right? To basically fund either a bigger trial or to basically introduce UBI.
mhm,
Um, and that's of course the goal that a lot of these UBI pilot funders have, and that many of us activists in the UBI movement have as well. Um, so so yeah, I mean, look, I mean, if there was a rich guy who came up to you and said, "Mike, please, uh, administer this basic income for
certain
homeless
groups.
people or for panhandlers,"
Yeah.
and give us a report after 6 months or a year. Um, yeah, I would say yeah, sure, why not? Let's do it.
Yeah, as an experiment, I
Um,
guess.
yeah, but in terms of like expecting good social scientific value out of it, I
Mhm.
am quite skeptical. In a
You don't
sense,
think it's representative, right?
no, it's because I think that I do think because good things are going to happen. That is to say, I think that panhandling incidents would come down, that levels of deprivation would come down, um, and that basically the knowledge that there's not endless amount of money, so people who have then a little bit of money, I mean, they're going to be very strategic about what they're going to be doing with the money.
Mhm.
So this is one uh, interview that I saw with Catherine Eden. She's a professor at my institute back then in Princeton. And so she would study these very poor people, right, who were living on less than $2 a day. That was the title of the book that she published. with Luke
Mhm.
Schaefer. And she would give $50 as a kind of like an interview, uh, like an incentive, right, for her interviews.
Yeah.
Um, and and she was, and so after she did an interview with a young woman who was very poor, gave her the $50, and she came back for a follow-up visit, a few weeks later or a month later, and and Eden was so surprised in a positive way because that research subject, she she bought kind of like nice clothes, she could, you know, I forgot exactly what the detail was of that story, but it was something positive. It was like,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I can
Not
afford,
wasteful. Not wasteful.
yeah, I can afford the business clothes that I can use to go for a job interview, right? Or I'm finally able to put gas in my tank in my car so I can drive to the interview, to the job interview. Right? I mean, it was even that, like the transportation to the interview, to the
Mhm.
job interview, was the obstacle to obtain the job, which would obtain the income so that they can get out of poverty. Right? I mean, it's just a simple
Crazy.
example
Crazy. Yeah.
like that, right?
Oh,
Where I mean, I'm sure like there's like hundreds of examples that you could capture with that. As a
yeah.
result of basic income experimentations. I mean, my favorite example has always been the, I think SIVA, which was the basic income in India.
Yeah.
Uh,
Micro, small amounts. Was it big
are you
amounts,
talking
small
about
amounts?
microfinance, the Muammar
Yeah.
Yunus? That's something else.
Yeah.
Yunus, I mean, his study also had very positive outcomes actually, but um, yeah, so the basic income trial in Madhya Pradesh in the central province in India, uh, and their main finding is that so all of the social, health, education, economic indicators all improved, right? Incidence of working is increasing, small business creation increasing, longevity, life expectancy increasing, nutritional deficiency decreasing, all these things. So all the good things are increasing, right? Um, and then they identified this one group that was losing out socially, right? And that was the local money lenders,
Hmm.
right?
Oh
Because
wow. It's just they used to profit off of the loans or
exactly,
something.
so if there was, so if okay, so you have these local farmers. If you have a good crop season, it's great, beautiful. You can make the money, sell it to the market. Now you have, let's say, a bad crop season. So, you're not able to sell enough grain to the market. So you're not making a lot of money. So it was during these economically lean periods that the poor farmers, they would go to these money lenders. Every village would have one. And they would generally be the wealthiest people in town because obviously they had money, right? They made back the interest, right? And these would be like day loans, like literally payday loans
Mhm.
come with, I don't know, like 7% interest per day. Um, yeah, and then for those villages that collected the basic income, the money lenders, there was no demand for them, basically. I can see
Huh.
why the money lenders would be opposed to basic income. I mean,
With
yeah, but
yeah,
that's
interest
that,
rates and all that. Yeah.
I mean, that's not a
Financial
reason to
stress.
oppose basic income in general, right?
Yeah. For
I mean,
them.
yeah, I think it would probably be a good thing. It would
Yeah,
probably
yeah,
be a
yeah.
good thing
Yeah, yeah.
to do a basic income. I mean, to
Which
squeeze out
which is
some money.
interesting. I mean, when I look, I don't know how it is in, Baltimore area, but there are lots of payday lending kind of enterprises particularly in low income communities, that they know people need cash loans, including title loan places. I don't know if you're familiar with title loan places. Title loan places basically take the title of your car as a kind of guarantee that you're going to pay the loan back, right? So these are very shark-like financial institutions that prey on the poor, particularly, right? High percentage of interest rates. So I mean, your argument, and I mean the outcome of the experiment in India, I can only imagine if you think about basic income being implemented in the U.S. and poor, first in poor neighborhoods, you know, but what that would do to the payday loan industry, right? Crazy, right?
Yeah,
Hypothetic,
yeah.
hypothetical, just a thought experiment. So,
And those are the people I think that we should be squeezing out. I mean, like they're predators basically. I mean, they're vultures who are
of
basically
course,
trying to feast on the prey on the corpses, right?
yeah, yeah,
Um,
definitely.
and like I mean, this kind of predation, right? I mean, you see this happening over and over again across the capitalist economy. Um, so I've been very interested on like fitness related issues.
Mhm.
And because I'm very concerned about you know diabetes and poor metabolic health and obesity and these kinds of
Yeah,
health related concerns. Um, and the fact that I mean, there's some like food companies that are supporting like this body positivity movement, right? Where the idea is that well, if you have you know if you're built bigger, then it's generally good, right? We have to embrace people of all shapes and so forth. Um, and I mean, I'm just thinking to myself, what's the point of that, really, right? I mean, like, why
mhm,
is it that we should be celebrating, poor metabolic health and poor general
mhm.
health? Um, um, yeah, and so so that's why it's another form I think of predation, right? Where I think the food companies that are very interested to sell us products that are producing poor metabolic health, right?
Yeah,
I mean, basically, I mean, effectively, I mean, the more added sugar, the more highly processed food that you offer um, to the people, and of course, if you make it sweet, there's something very carnal about sweetness, the so-called sugar craving, right?
yeah,
Where and the problem also with sugar craving and sweet tooth is that if you eat a little bit sweet, then it activates this thing in your brain that's going to make
so
you
addicted to it, right?
makes you addicted to it, so you want even more of the sugar. And then the metabolic health declines, right? You're going to have insulin resistance, you're going to have diabetes and so forth. And the way to counter that, apparently, I mean, is well, it's to cut out the sugar, and then you have to replace it with other nutritious food that's not going to you know make you pile up the pounds. And so it would be very hearty, meaty dishes, right? you know um and that's why I mean there's a lot of buzz about carnivore diet, like people who only eat meat. um
Caveman's diet, right?
yeah, ketogenic diet, right, which is about cutting out the like carbohydrates, bringing the body into ketosis. Those diets, they have been quite effective, actually, I think, in reducing uh, like diabetes and other metabolic issues. Um, but yeah, I mean, yeah, if you have like a more fat-rich diet, I think it'd probably be, you know,
healthier.
yeah, it would be much more beneficial. But what I find interesting is that if you look at the general dietary guidelines, they are very much in favor of low-fat diet, right? So they only want you to eat like the lean poultry and the fish, right? And then you should quench your hunger with whole grain nuts and seeds, right? And then with fruits and vegetables. And so if you go for a low fat diet, I mean, well, what does it mean? So okay, so you keep the protein share constant, right? Because
Hmm.
there's a limit as to how much protein your body can intake. So you have to make up the balance with carbohydrates. And the carbohydrates your body converts into sugar. I mean, if you're a very athletic person, it's probably okay to eat a little bit more sugar, a little bit more carbohydrates, right? Like bread and pasta and rice and so forth. Um, but you know, but there's going to be, you know, there's going to be some kind of limit, I think. And so that's why I don't know. I mean, whether these general dietary guidelines are even reasonable.
Workforce.
But
Yeah. You think they're partly shaped by, you know, corporations, kind of their interest in profit, and I mean this whole idea of a food industrial complex. Uh, that a lot of the availability of products, what's put out there. I mean, these are massive corporations that own a lot of the food choices. So there's a focus on particular diets, which I guess people just have to consume regularly, and they always have to go back to the store. The reason why I bring this up, I mean, if you think about different diets in different countries, in one country, people could, use rice or potatoes. But like when I look at like Western diets, a lot of it is, quick hamburger helper kind of stuff. It's frozen food, it's frozen this, frozen that, pre-made. That doesn't require a lot of time for people to cook because they're working class people. So, and canned goods, things like that, which again is bad, as we know, is bad food, very salty, horrible ingredients, but it's profitable, I guess for the business perspective. Um, I even looked at the availability of certain kinds of produce. Uh, you and I, we're like from Europe, so we're familiar with different kinds of apples. But something that I always found striking is the lack of available apples in the U.S. Most grocery stores will have four brands, the Red Delicious, Granny Smith, and
Gala,
yeah, those because those are last longer
Fuji,
and very profitable. But there's some of the apples that get easily, um, how do you say, damaged, and the profit margins are a lot lower. And so a lot of times you don't have a diversity of food options. If you go to produce, you have, russet potatoes and red potatoes. But one thing I remember when I was in Europe is that you have more options. Um, I mean, they also make profit off the food, but a lot of it's more local farmers also contribute to the process of more options for things like produce. But if you have, like in the US, you have large farms, it's an industrial kind of agriculture where everything is massively produced, we get four apples brands, unless you go to upscale places like Costco or something, right? That's my observation. So it's a profit oriented food system.
Yeah, for sure. I think that
Yeah,
if you look at the general dietary guidelines that are very grain heavy, it was the U.S. Department of Agriculture that came up with this food pyramid, and the big grain producers, they wanted to sell their grain. And so, I mean, if you look at the history of a lot of I mean, not just in North America, but in the European countries too, the history of agricultural policy, it was always driven by this ideology of abundance and self-sufficiency, right? So this idea that you had to produce sufficient amount of grains so that you are not dependent on imports from other countries who might be denying to sell you their grain if their own economy goes bad or something like that. Um, and so this was the idea of abundance and self-sufficiency. Um, and the government would also subsidize the production of agriculture in order to produce this outcome. And so we came at a point where I would say by the middle of the last century, um, this country was producing so much, rice and wheat and corn that that like they had to find a way to sell it. So I mean, of course, you could sell the grains in like the direct form, right? Like basically selling corn and rice and so forth. Or you could embed these products elsewhere. So through industrial processing. So if, for instance, I mean, so basically, I mean, so any product that contains high fructose corn syrup, right?
yeah,
Like, so anything that's got this added sugar, um, the added corn syrup, in, ketchup or something, right? Any
yeah.
packaged like saucy items, um, you basically, this is a way to basically be able to sell this kind of surplus to the population. And I mean, it clearly wasn't healthy, but I think that the farm lobby, I think, was successful in bringing the U.S. Department of Agriculture to create these food recommendations that were highly favorable to its grain products.
Mhm.
Um, Even though there's not necessarily any evidence that this is beneficial to health. Um, in fact, I mean, basically, the less processed the food product, the healthier it is. So, it would be minimally processed, fruits and vegetables and dairy products, and meat, animal proteins. These are the minimally processed foods where if people consumed more of those, there would be less, you know, disease incidence.
Mm.
Um, you know, um, but then the flip side of it is, I mean, I can see, like, for instance, pharma companies and the doctors, some of them are also working together, right? Where, what they want is, I mean, they don't necessarily want, you know, s- like death in the population, right? And, that not be good. But what they want is to, chronically sick patients, right?
Mm.
People who are able to function based on the medication that would be given to them, right? So, if you produce a lot of medicine, you want to make sure that there's consistent demand for this kind of medication.
Supply demand, yeah. I didn't look at it from that perspective. Yeah. So there's
Yeah,
definitely a relationship there.
yeah, for sure. And
Mm.
and so that's why I think that, um You know, yeah, the system is definitely not working
Yeah.
necessarily for the maximization of, the common good. I mean, um, if you have to choose between profits and the common good, um, most societies now, I think,
So profit share.
would choose the profits. Yeah.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
yeah, it's about, I mean, Weber calls it like a rationally calculable goal, right? Um, that our
But
societies are
you think it
pursuing.
also explains the attitudes towards global warming, profit over the common good? Like it's uh, from a perspective of companies, it's profit matters more than the common good of having an environment that functions. Profit always is more important than the common good of equitable environmental outcomes. From that perspective, it was just an economic perspective, pure economic interest. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yes, I think that but I think so with climate, I do think there's some awareness. I think among all the actors, I mean, even though all companies are admitting, hey, this is probably happening, and of course they funded studies that was very long in the business of denial, outright denial, even though their own internal scientists, the people that were actually tasked with studying this issue, were saying that climate change is a serious problem. But the voices were effectively suppressed for a long time.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, it's impossible to suppress this opinion the um, because the evidence just gets more and more overwhelming, right? I mean, like 2023, I mean, we're facing the hottest year in recorded history. I mean,
Mm.
obviously, I mean, if you go back, you know, several millions of years ago, yeah, I mean, you're going to find much higher temperatures. I think we were at like 13 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial average. Right now we're at 1.5. Um, um, but that was long before you know Homo sapiens existed. It was long before even the hominids
Mhm.
existed. So you know,
Lucy.
yeah, I mean, our you know ancestral, you could say, genetic material, or yeah, our species more or less is not adjusted to temperatures that are that extreme. I mean, of course, you could make the argument, well, the Earth is going to do fine, even if it's like 10, 20 degrees warming, right? I mean, sure. I mean, the surface is going to be a little bit hotter. I mean, there's going to be much more intense rainfalls, there's more water evaporations and heavy rainfalls for sure. Um, the Earth is going to do fine. I mean, it's just a matter of whether humans are still going to be around.
Yeah, we have
Um,
uninhabitable places. Yeah, like uninhabitable places that people can't live anymore because it will be so hot and humid. And yeah,
Yeah, I mean it's kind of already happening, right? I mean, you see
yeah,
places, in I think it was in Iraq or
yeah.
um, like in
India too. I think
India.
there were some cases, some days it was so hot that they had thousands of people that died
Yeah,
in
it
the
could go
summer
up
of last year.
like 60 Celsius, maybe 50, 60 Celsius. I mean,
Yeah,
these are incredible temperatures. I mean, the boiling point temperature. I mean, so we do have this boiling point kind of temperature, right? I mean, basically, we don't want it to go above our internal temperature, which would probably be about 35, 36, something like that. The wet bulb temperature, right?
mm,
Yeah, we don't want to go much above that, because then at that point, you're gonna have dizziness, headache, fainting, all of these things, largely because your internal organs are starting to
break
cook,
down.
literally.
Yeah,
Right? I mean, if you, I mean, that's the thing. I mean, that's what I mean. If you cook any kind of meat, I mean, you see the color of the meat changes, right? It's like because you're cooking it, right? Um, and that's kind of would happen to us if we were exposed to these high temperatures for a long time. I was listening to this uh, podcast with Michael Schellenberger, and um, so he's a little bit more in the cautious camp regarding, the climate change, what he calls the climate change narrative. So he thinks it is a serious problem, and that you can do nuclear energy, to kind of deal with it. But ultimately, he thinks that the climate change movement is driven by um, what he calls a death cult, right? Where basically, I mean, you have mostly young people who are so convinced that we are on a path to its self-destruction. Um, but in the process of that, they would impose very harsh prohibitions on the population. Um, to the extent that where it's not just about like becoming vegan or stopping to fly planes, but it's really about active steps to reduce the human population. Like the birth strike, right? The refusal to have babies, which is especially among female environmental activists, right? Um, you could say, well, it's a small number. Right? It's a very small number. I mean, it might not be the main reason that fertility is declining all over the world. Um, but yeah, the what Schellenberg calls a death cult. I mean, Elon Musk does the same thing. I mean, um, he has 10 children, and he's deeply convinced um, that low fertility is equivalent to the self-destruction of the species, that must be reversed by encouraging fertility. Um, and it, it, it's quite interesting because it is the system that made him rich, made him the richest man on the planet. It is that same system that is reducing the rate of fertility. So, I mean, if he was concerned
Mm.
about fertility, I mean, you'd have to think about, well, what's the role that the capitalist economy plays in this, to produce this situation, right? Um, because the more commodification of life, right? The more everything is about buying and selling things, the more individualistic the society becomes. And and individualism, I mean, as an ideology, I mean, is very much anti-family if you think about it.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, anybody who says, um, I want to focus on my career, you know, I want to, obtain, immediate sexual pleasures, for instance. Um, yeah, I mean, I maybe want to have a pet, right? Don't want to have children.
Instead of a child, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, if that's kind of what the framework is that a lot of people are moving towards, and definitely a lot of young people are moving in that direction.
Do you think that go maybe jumping to Polanyi real quick? Do you think that's why Polanyi uses this term fictitious commodities, that human life was never meant to be, commodified or put on the table to translate into some commodity form? And that this attempt by capital to influence human life more and more, when it comes to food, cars, housing, that all these have a direct impact on the social reproduction of people too. I mean, that's why the idea is that people will have less children, because people are thinking materialistically and everything. don't think about family life and other things outside of the capital kind of matrix. Is that a fair statement? I don't, like the fictitious commodity idea itself, because you had three, you had what, land, labor, money, but what if it's humans too? I mean, humans as far as producing,
Well, the humans
uh,
should be part of the labor, right? So,
yeah, labor, yeah, yeah. But the material aspects of us as material aspects that we need something to eat, we need something to live, that we are starting to be commodified in that way. I know it sounds postmodern, but like this is the whole idea of, like capital accumulation, and people are forced into the matrix of you got to accumulate capital, and you got to, make money, a certain amount of money in a lifetime. And then this affects, the decision for offspring or no offspring,
yeah, I
right?
mean, it's not a grand conspiracy theory, right? I mean,
Yeah,
basically, the more commodified your society becomes, the lower the rate of fertility. I mean, you see
yeah.
this in every
It's a
single
demographic principle, right? Real basic demographic trajectory. More industrialized, your fertility rates drop.
more exactly,
Post-industrialized.
that's right. Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, this is an very uncontroversial theory because we see this, you know, happening at a very regular clip. And what I find very interesting, I mean, I saw this graphic about the time that it took for different countries to halve their fertility rate from 6 to 3, right, children per woman.
Mhm.
And it took the longest in the UK, which is the first industrializing country. It took about 100 years or so. Uh, and 150 years even, I think. While in Iran, China, I mean, these are really late industrializers. Like, we're talking maybe after 1980. I mean, you probably have a little bit of development that's happening. Um, you see this kind of transformation happening within 11 years. 11 years, that's same as this half a
Wow,
generation,
crazy.
the time that it takes to have the fertility rate. Um, and the really the pace of social change at the moment that you're introducing the capitalist commodity economy is going to substantially reduce the rate of fertility. And I think it's not surprising why it would be,
Mm,
because if you're the first industrializing country, I mean, the increments of technological and thereby social change is going to be very slow, right? I mean, from basically from the invention of the steam engine towards the invention of electricity. I mean, I think there's some time distance between these two events, right? It's like a lot of cumulative small innovations that then ultimately result in big leaps forward in technology.
mhm,
If you are a developing global south country, the rate of economic development that potentially could happen is so much faster than for the first industrializing countries. Because all you have to do is what? You have to do copy paste, right?
mhm.
You take the technology of the rich countries, you import those technologies into your own country, right? I mean, think of like,
Railways and stuff like that.
yeah, I mean, driving a Mercedes Benz in
Yeah.
sub-Saharan Africa, right? You could do that. I
Mhm.
mean, it's not
Toyota
like
Land Cruiser, I think.
a Land Cruiser might be
Toyota
better
Land
for that.
Cruiser.
Yeah, that
Toyota has a
Land
lot
Cruiser
of,
might be better for that. Yeah, for sure.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, but you get the gist, right? It's like you just copy paste, and so that's why that's why you can just leapfrog, right? You can just go right into the frontier of development, and so the pace of commodification is just going to be much quicker too, right? Um, and then
Accelerates.
yeah, right, and then also all of the medical
Urbanization too,
advances.
hyper urbanization. Because it would concentrate more effort on the cities, and so there's hyper urbanization that those cities even grow a lot faster. Lagos, Nigeria, for instance, or So in the global south, I think the city, there's a focus on the city itself, which is connected to international markets too, right? So it's not like spread the development, I think, isn't spread evenly throughout a country. It usually maximized within the city hubs. And so that's why I think sometimes you see slums forming in major cities of the global south because the cities are also overwhelmed with this rapid pace of development. That makes sense. Yeah, definitely.
That's right. Yeah, yeah. And then of course, if you concentrate more people, I mean, it has certain advantages, right? In terms of the labor pool that you can draw to work in, factories and offices and, places like that. Um, but also the ideological reach that you have, right, in terms of the lifestyle, like the individualist philosophy, right, of life that is encouraged through the commodity economy, right, where the idea is that, I mean, I think Georg Simmel talks about that, right, where
Bauman, consuming
well,
life.
yeah, well, so Simmel talks about this idea of like
Metro.
individualization of money, right? So because if you spend money, right, um you don't have to create a substantive relationship with the seller of the product, right? So because in the old days, like let's say we lived in the same village, right? And I didn't know how to fix my shoes that has a hole in it, right? But you are my neighbor in the village, and you would probably fix the shoes for free for me, because we're neighbors, but in exchange, I might you know fix your roof if it has a leak or something like that, right?
Mhm, mhm,
So it's like a reciprocity based, morally dense economy, social economy, right?
mhm.
Um, Now, if I move into the city now, basically all I have is a dollar bill in my pocket, or nowadays just a credit card, right? And you know, and you sell me the shoes, right? And you swipe my credit card, money will be drawn from my account to your account, and then you hand me over the shoe, and I never see you again, right?
Yeah.
So I mean, so that's kind of the anonymization, and it gives you freedom, right? So this whole
Mhm.
idea of individual freedom means that there's no dense moral economy, right? There's no dense moral network that I'm
No
obligated to
Gemeinschaft.
other people, right? There's no
Yeah.
Gemeinschaft. Um, and so this kind of um, setting, of course, is highly individualizing, right? Um, like this whole idea of like individual, status groups. Weber described a lot, right? I mean, we could
Yeah.
have that in cities, right?
Cities.
We don't have, individualized activities, like for instance, like being a sports fan, right? Like, oh, I like this local football team or something like that. And then you might like the local baseball team, so we have different sports. So we have different communities of interest, right?
Mm.
Even though, we could be living in the same city, right? Um, yeah. And so that's the issue, right? Where, yeah, people just individualize. Um, and the end product of that individualization, I think, um, is then, yeah, the lack of procreation, right? The lack of social norms that would um, basically push the ego to the wayside for some time, really.
Mhm.
Because I mean, people who are raising small children, um, they cannot have a big ego because otherwise, the kid might starve, right? So you have to provide for the child, for the other human being, right? So um um yeah, so and that's so I So in a sense, I mean, in a very crude ways, a crude biologic sense, I do agree
Mhm.
with Elon Musk, that it would be ideal to have some level of procreation. Um, and then the other thing is, okay, well, can you combine this with the environmental objectives? Because I mean, you also have to consider that. I mean, the reason why our carbon footprint isn't even higher than it is today is because not everybody in the global south lives the way we do in the global north.
Yeah.
Right. So if I said right now, okay, I wanted to integrate the people from the global south into the lifestyle that we have here in the north, the same consumption patterns, um, I do think that it's going to be quite catastrophic. Um,
Mhm.
so
That'd be a manufactured risk, right? Or unintended consequence. It could be both, I guess. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, the only saver you could say would be, yeah, if you have like space stations, or like a way how you
Yeah.
can suspend
Externalized.
planetary boundaries. Yeah,
Yeah.
if we can suspend those boundaries, then yeah, I think then we could look. I mean, look, if there's no resource constraint, we could do the compound economic growth of, let's say, 2 to 3%, and we could do this into eternity, right? As long as we have, let's say, we keep a fertility rate of about 2.5, right, for the whole population in the world. Um, and we have about 2 to 3% economic growth every year. Right. So it was a little bit of population growth, or was a little bit of consumption growth. Or we could say, well, actually, the pursuit of endless growth is just insanity. That we've got to stop it. Um,
That's the post-scarcity idea, right? Is it utopian or dystopian? Post-scarcity. The technology will one day enable a post-scarce environment where scarcity will be something we don't have to worry about anymore. Do you think that's feasible, even in a future, possibly, or too utopian?
yeah, I mean, is it just in terms of ideologically? I would say yes, it is possible. But I mean, I was wondering physically,
Okay.
is it physically possible? Right. So, really, really talking about the laws of physics here, right? So,
Mhm. Okay.
we might, because so far, every time that we have increased consumption and we have increased GDP, we have increased the economy and society, the size of the population, you know, we have drawn more resources out of the ground, right?
Mhm.
Resources out of the ground, and then burning the fossil fuel, right, and spewing the waste product into the atmosphere. Every time that we have grown, right, we have not been able historically to sever that link, between economic growth and some version of pollution, right? Um, and even this idea of like decoupling, right? Which you see, I mean, you see a lot of graphs nowadays where the growth, the GDP goes up, and then the CO2 goes down for many countries in the global north. Um, I think there's a problem in accounting, right?
Yeah, I think you're right.
Where basically, if you look at the global CO2, it's still going up because the Chinese are adding coal plants. The Indians are adding coal plants. I mean, they already two of them are like one third of the world population. They have significant space for growth going forward in the future, because they're still basically growing economies. They're not at the level in the West, right? Um, so so in the global historical sense, we haven't been able to divorce economic growth and pollution, right? Carbon pollution. Um, so that makes me incredibly pessimistic thus far.
So you're
And
saying it's very embedded, right? It's very embedded in the structure of our societies, even how our societies operate. I mean, materialistically, and how food production to economics to everything we do, and the direct impact it has on the environment. Right? It's just a calculation that's you
yeah, I
cannot
mean,
separate it.
there's a big impact on the environment for sure.
Mm, yeah.
And now you could say, well, you get 2% growth in industrial revolution era, like Britain, like in Lancashire, right? If you go 2.5% growth, or Manchester, um, that's probably okay because it was a very small economy back then. But
Mhm.
now you fast forward to 2023, I mean, our economy is so much bigger than it was back then. So now if you
Wow.
add even 1% to our economy here, I mean, the amount of biomass that you are, you know, requiring to generate this 1% growth is so much bigger than it was 200 years ago, right?
Mhm.
Um, so, I mean, eventually, yeah, I mean, what is going to be the ultimate limit? I mean, is it going to be the scarcity of the fossil fuel as a resource? Um, or is it going to be the the scarcity of like livable patch of land,
Mhm.
right? I mean, because we could argue that the livable patch of land is kind of shrinking, right?
Yeah.
So
Definitely next 50, 100 years. Yeah. I
yeah,
can see it.
I mean so the thing is, I mean, so you remember, like in my childhood, I think there was a discussion about peak oil, right? It was like in the early 2000s.
Mhm.
It was a discussion about peak oil. I think you're a little bit older than me, so
Yeah. People.
you might remember those discussions, right?
Yeah.
Um, and I think after 2005, I don't think anybody talks about peak oil anymore because the Americans figured out how to do fracking. Fracking is a technology that was developed over here, and I think that nowadays, I mean, if you take the same like hydraulic fracking technology and you try to apply this, to other places in the world, like in Guyana, they have found huge oil deposits, right? Which is why Venezuela wants to grab the western province of Guyana, even though Venezuela already has the biggest oil supply in the world. Um, but it looks to me like that our innovation allows us to draw more oil from the ground.
Mhm.
So we solve this one particular problem, which is, the resource scarcity, right? That would not allow us to, you know, live the lifestyle that we have any longer. So we solve that problem. But but we're opening a can of worms. I mean, basically, we're saying that there's even more carbon that we're going to spew into the atmosphere.
The vicious cycle. Yeah. You know.
Yeah, and then it is a big question. Like, are we going to be able to develop the kinds of technologies that that would allow us to reduce the fossil fuel consumption? Um, I mean, I know the governments have tried to do these subsidies for electric vehicles, but I mean, again, it's one of these issues where, like, how much is that going to work? I mean, how practicable, is the electric vehicle, and how small is the carbon footprint really with EVs,
Mhm.
right? Because there's some amount of resources that you are drawing from the ground as well. I mean, the mining. Um, um, and then there's also issues about reliability, right? I mean, how long do the batteries last you? Um,
Wouldn't you
and
say,
stuff
though,
like
in Europe, the strategy is to transform the infrastructure, and the infrastructure becomes, the place where they basically do Keynesian kind of state spending, putting railways, tracks, uh, and then you don't have to worry about having this heavy truck, transportation of goods. I mean, you could say in Europe, I mean, they do have railways that do a lot of the work that in the US, they're very much dependent on, this diesel trucks to move a lot of the cargo within the states. I'm not saying they don't have that in Europe. Europe, they still have the tractors, big trucks, but they have another option. They can use the infrastructure and they can use the railways. Some of those are electrified, not all of them, but at least they can use them. And then it's actually very useful for them. And then you remember a lot of, when I lived in Germany, I mean, you can just commute around on a bicycle. uh, so cities are actually structured that way. So, but in North America, cities are just so wide apart, and the space is just so wide, so big that you have to almost rebuild the infrastructure. In the global South cities, yeah, that would be a problem. I don't know how they can transform their infrastructure to where they wouldn't burn as much fuel, have at least a different infrastructure in place. Think that would solve it? Infrastructure, how the infrastructure is built up, transportation, not just manufacturing. Of course, they're going to have to get to the factories eventually. How do they produce the energy for the factories, steel factories, for instance? I think, but maybe just start out with transportation and then go from there in some cities of the world. You know, like railway or something. Yeah, or ban like you can only have one car, I guess, per family or per household. Tax the
yeah, I mean, that proposal would be difficult. I think that because when I moved up here in Baltimore, I mean, I didn't have a car back in Princeton
yeah.
because I lived right next to the department, so it wasn't necessary. Over here, I mean, yeah, I mean, I could commute an hour by bus because the bus stop is not, right where I live. Um, or I could, commute by car, which is about 12 minutes. Right. So already there, I mean, you can already see,
Yeah.
why the car was not an avoidable option in here, right? That, you needed to get around. Um, and
Yeah.
So it really depends, like, how you build out the city, right? Because I know, like if, like, let's say if I had found a job in Vienna, right? Like, where my brother is right now,
Mhm.
like, he doesn't have a car, right? And he doesn't really need it. I mean, his commute, I think, is about a little bit more than half an hour,
Oh wow, that's good.
but by public transportation, right? But takes the trolley car, right? Public transit. And yeah, it's superbly well connected. I mean, I was visiting another friend back last summer, and he works in the 14th district, so a little bit in the west side of Vienna, and then
Mhm.
and he lives up in the northeast side, near. I think in Floridsdorf. There's probably 21st district, I want to say. So the northeast part, that's actually the region that's growing, right? So a
Okay.
lot of the like new apartment buildings, like 21st and 22nd district, Donaustadt, um, that used to be just basically open farmland back then, and then I think now as the city is growing, they are building more and more infrastructure over there. They they lengthened the U1 and U2, which is the two subway lines that connect to the city. So they both connect to the city downtown.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, and he commutes by subway. It's like about maybe 40, 45 minutes for him. Subway
Yes.
commute. He has a car, but he doesn't use it for a daily commute. Also like city traffic on cars is really
Horrible,
yeah, it's terrible because because I mean because you have like a few like you have like a few major roads,
huh? Hmm.
the road artery, which is like maybe three lanes, right?
Let's
Um,
say the gas goes by the liter, right? So not by the gallon.
by
Gas is
the
more
leader,
expensive,
yeah.
more expensive there, right?
Yeah, if you do the calculation, I mean, it's probably 9-10 euros a gallon, right? Something like that, right?
Yeah. Oh wow.
It's definitely much higher with because the gas taxes are just much higher over there. Um, and also they have to import probably a lot of the gas from
Mhm.
outside. Um, yeah, so the economics of the cars is much more favorable for this place for the U.S. Um, and then in the Europe, yeah, in the European cities. Look, I mean, like if you live in the suburbs of Vienna, like if you live in like Niederösterreich in Lower Austria in the province,
Mhm.
um, you need a car to
Yeah,
get where you need to go.
it's
For
more
sure.
rural area, right?
Yeah, a more rural area for sure. Yeah, and then if you live
Yeah.
in the outskirts of Vienna, you still have public transit, so you still have a few buses that are connecting, but then it's like every half hour, maybe once an hour. And then probably like around nighttime, if it's like later in the evening, you can probably forget about the bus, right? So, so
Yeah.
I think if you go more rural, like the outskirts of Vienna, I think you're gonna find a lot of public transit issues. But for most people that are living in the city and they're working in the city, I think there's no reason to have a car, right?
Yeah.
It's
Which,
probably
for them is reduced impact of pollution. Air, I bet you air quality is probably better. But maybe the problem is the mass trans, the movement of goods into the country, how that happens. Because I think even Austria still relies on, those big German trucks that bring in the groceries, for instance. I mean, they haven't been able to put everything on railway. And sometimes rails break, and so there's still a lot of focus on those big trucks. But at least, those trucks, I think they try to make them more efficient over there. I know they have stricter standards with fuel efficiency with trucks.
well, I
Uh,
mean,
but
every year there's like this dispute
yeah,
in Austria regarding the excess truck traffic
no,
in the western part of Austria. So like the province of Tyrol that connects Bavaria and Germany and Italy, right? Um, and so you have the Brenner Tunnel, which goes underneath the province of Tyrol as it goes through Tyrol to basically connect Germany and Italy with each other, right? And basically Austria is then mostly a transit territory, right?
no,
And every year there's disputes basically between these three countries where I mean kind of the Austrians are like, okay, well, if you wanted to use, our country as a transit, right?
Yeah, pay
Um,
for it.
you have to pay more for it, right?
Yeah,
So every year there's a dispute about like how much to pay and stuff. Um, and because the difficulty also, so like in the flat areas, like in the northern eastern part, like around Vienna, right, where the territory is relatively flat, right? I mean, you can build a lot of highways. I mean, you can even expand the highway lanes. Um, in Tyrol, it's very tough to make the highways
yeah,
broader. I mean, they have two-lane highways. Um, but it's very hard to expand further
yeah.
because
The
if you think
mountains and
about
all
it, right,
that.
exactly, the mountains. So you build all the villages. I mean, if you look at the map, right? So they build the villages in the valleys, right? I mean, the valleys are literally like these very narrow, like kind of straight lines.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And that's where you build all of the settlements, right? All of the villages. Um, if if let's say the two-lane highways that go through these valleys, if they're inundated, right? So if there's like long traffic jams that's going to back up in the highway, what the trucks are then trying to do is they're trying to go and take the local roads, right? And
Oh
so,
yeah. Mess that irritates the locals.
yeah, I mean, the locals are really getting upset, right? Because then all of a sudden, like they can no longer drive to where they need to go, right? Because they have to wait for, these huge trucks to pass, right?
Yeah,
Um, yeah, so that's why I mean this is a perennial dispute, but it has to do with, well, I mean in this case the resource scarcity would be the available land, right? Um, yeah.
yeah.
Um,
I think Austria is pretty much out of land, right? I mean, there's not much more you could, right? And that's probably explains why the land. I mean, to build something, a family house is very expensive. I'm willing to bet. Family house, like a two-story, easy 1 million euros, I would suspect. Yeah, am I about right? It's about a
yeah, I was
million, I think.
visiting another like army friend recently, and he showed me his house that he built in the 12th district, which is quite surprising. I mean, it's not too far from the center, but it was a house
Yeah.
that it's like a single house. Um, and I was quite struck. I mean, that you can build them in the city, within the city vicinity.
Oh wow.
Because mostly, I mean, if you desire to own your own house, people usually tend to do this in the outskirts. So it would be the suburbs. That's where you can build your houses. Um, in the city, generally, I mean, the land use is usually such that you have like 6-story apartment buildings. That's kind of the standard. I mean,
Yeah.
it definitely in
Munich
all of the
too.
interior districts.
Yeah, it's like that in Munich.
Yeah, right. But I mean, but I think it's this kind of. I mean, my take is that this is the ideal population density. Because I was reading accounts of like Seoul in South Korea, where I mean, if you look at the population distribution, right? So you have 50 million people in the whole South Korean portion of the peninsula, um, and half the population, so 25 million, are in the capital, so the Seoul metro area. So you can see how lopsided it is. Well, how can you sustain half of your whole population in this one, urban megalopolis? And the answer is high rises. So, so you have you have the downtown area, and it's completely built up. I mean, you can barely see the sky, really, right?
Mm,
Um, so high rises everywhere.
amazing.
And I don't know. I mean, because because I was just reading about this like New York City traffic congestion, where I think the average speed at which the cars travel in Midtown Manhattan, so it's the downtown area, it's 7 miles per hour.
Hmm.
7 miles per hour, right? This is the average speed because it's just like you can barely get ahead, right? It was completely backed up.
Yeah,
It's just
massive,
yeah. I mean that amount of population density is not healthy at all.
feasible. Yeah.
Um, yeah. I mean you concentrate people like ants, and then this whole idea of like this like this New Yorker attitude of like blasé attitude, elbowing and not being nice to others and stuff. Uh, of course, it's going to be like that. I mean, this is the only way how you can survive if you're like just one of many ants in this giant colony, right?
In this concrete utopia. You watched
This
that movie
concrete,
that came out? Concrete Utopia?
concrete utopia. I have not seen that
South
movie.
Korean movie. You got to watch it. It's this they have an earthquake in the city, and there's only one concrete apartment left, and everybody else is trying to get to this one remaining apartment, and it's like warfare, because of space. The earthquake destroys all the houses, but there's only one apartment that is left open. You need to watch it. I think it was on Netflix. Concrete Utopia. It's a South Korean film, has English subtitles. Very good. Of course, it's
Conc-
dystopian, but I can see the humor when watching it. It was very good.
yeah,
So we
the
all live in concrete utopias, I guess, to some
yeah,
extent.
yeah. I mean, so if it goes to that extreme, I mean, also, I mean, I've lived in the U.S. now, what, 15 years, and
Mhm.
um, almost all. I mean, so I've lived in suburbs twice now, and then in a small town in Princeton. So, um, and when I was back in Princeton, I mean, I would visit in New York because I'd have a lot of friends there. Um, and I kind of was looking forward to like this hustle and bustle, like briefly. But then I was also very glad, like whenever I got back on the train back home to Princeton,
Mhm.
where it was like really quiet, very low population density, and I was
Relax more.
yeah, I was kind of looking forward again to go back home, right? And and that's because I think it is a little bit too overwhelming to be in New York, right? Like for
Yeah,
instance,
it
there
can
wouldn't
be.
be yeah, there wouldn't be a single moment where there wouldn't be like the ambulance that would be going by, right? Because in a big city like that, I mean, somebody's gonna have a heart attack, right? Like somebody's gonna have a drug overdose or something, right?
What you're getting at is actually what Van Agger theorized on. He called it speeding up fast capitalism. And he thought the speed of this, like cities and just, everybody going fast was just having havoc on our bodies, on our diets, and our workplaces. Agar wrote a book on this, but he had this, conflict perspective that he added towards the speed of city life, itself, and economies within cities, everything's accelerated, uh, speeding up everything, if you go to New York, there's lots of advertisements that just you get bombarded with ads, right? Times Square.
Yeah, on the health issue, I mean, so I was listening to a podcast with a Irish medical researcher. I forgot his name, but his whole shtick was about the importance of walking and the benefits of walking to health, which is a very clearly established link. And he did mention once that that on his visits to the US, I mean, he notices that it is much more difficult to do the walking, to do safe walking in particular, right?
More hazardous. Yeah.
Yeah, because oftentimes, like, let's say, like, so, because distances would be oftentimes too far because you would have, like in the suburbs, you have like single family houses, they have like huge properties. So, so if you wanted to go to the grocery store, it's a little bit further away. So it'd be a really long hike. But even if you could hike that path, um, the problem was that like the street crossings, right? So if you have a big road, let's say you have like 6 lanes to cross, right? And so maybe there's this one traffic light at this one intersection. But even for that one intersection, you might have to run or walk really fast to get across, right?
Uh,
Um, or and then you would have to cross the parking lots to get into the store, right? So
yeah.
that adds like an additional distance. So then basically it doesn't feel that safe physically to be doing so
Yeah.
much walking, right? And then he said, well, his advice to his American friends would be to take a walk inside of the house, like pacing around, right? Like when you're, let's say, taking a phone call or,
Yeah.
you know, or you're reading a book or something, you just be in the room and start pacing back and forth. And that would be like a form of exercise. But you can clearly see, I mean, even that kind of advice is much inferior to, being able to take a walk outside and on the street, right? Um, yeah.
That's why they build all the gyms everywhere so that you pay for membership that you work out at a gym that's 500 yards away from your park. I mean, really, seriously, like I don't know how it is in your city, but like in my city here, there's like 4 or 5 gyms that are all just located not so far away, but I think you could build more sidewalks, that people could walk. But if you don't build enough sidewalks, people then have to pay for gym membership, to use the gyms and make sense? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
It's a
To
capitalist.
modify that. Yeah.
No, there's a big industry. Gyms are a big, big industry. They can be convenient, but I'm surprised there's so many of them. There's so many, gyms that operate on a just small revenue. I'm, but in my city, I don't know how it is in other cities, but
Yeah, it's a really big question. Like, how much, like, historically speaking, I mean, if you're really going
yeah,
back to, like, you know, hunter-gatherer or farming communities, right? Because for me, these are always like the benchmarks for comparison. Like, how much vigorous, intense exercise was there in those ancient civilizations? Um, and I would say it would not be that much. I mean, I'm sure, like, certainly there could be some moments where, like, if you're hunting wild game, where you have to run, like where you have to sprint. So that's why I think the human body is very adaptable to its sprinting, right? It does it much better than
yeah,
some of the other animals in the animal kingdom. Um, but as for running, like this idea of, like, getting on a treadmill and running for half an hour or an hour. Um, it does sound to me like it's a more modern kind of
yeah.
session.
Probably more recreational too, and less tied to survival instincts in hunter and gathering societies. Or I mean, the forest was the gym. I guess you could use that metaphor. In modern societies, it's such commercialized thing, that's seen as recreational,
Well,
on
recreational,
top of people's work. Yeah. Go ahead.
but also important for survival reasons, if you think about it, because in some sense,
Okay.
the sedentary lifestyle, the obesity, all these things. I mean, it kind of shows to us that it's very easy to kind of neglect exercise altogether, right? And so, it is really the search for fitness. We have to consciously build this into our daily life plan. Otherwise, we wouldn't get enough of it. Versus if you're a hunter or if you're a farmer, I was just listening to a podcast with um, this old Canadian rancher. She's 82 years old, but she still looks quite young in her 50s. And she thinks it's because of carnivore diet. She eats a lot of meat and butter and things like that. It might be some of it, but I think also some, and then but also she explains her lifestyle, her daily lifestyle, right? Which is basically keeping up the farm, right? The effort to, I mean, like there's a certain order in which you do things, right? So you go to the hens, you collect the eggs that they lay, right? So then you have to feed the cows, um
Different routines, I guess. Different daily routines and behavior. Yeah.
yeah,
A
yeah,
different kind of division of labor for the individual.
that's right, that's right.
Yeah.
So and then in a sense, well, because you're always working in a physical sense, right? um Kind of the best way to describe it is like being on your feet all the time. And that
Yeah.
seems to me that's natural, right? Versus this idea of like, okay, well, in industrial civilization, we say, okay, well, I buy a chair, I buy a couch, I put this into my living room, and then I get to sit down, for, 7, 8 hours a day, right? And then 8 hours a day, I get to lie in bed, right? So, so only during these, restricted hours, I would be up on my feet, right? So so most of the time, I do not have to be on my feet, right? Um, and I think that's the source of a lot of unhealth. And then we have to pay money to the gyms as a compensatory mechanism.
And in nutritious foods, like the uh I mean, again, it's connected to the diet industry, the gyms. I mean, it's the protein shakes. It's the uh, you have to sometimes join associations. Like if you wanted to join a bodybuilder kind of conference, there's money involved there. Even bicycle clubs, there's certain kind of money involved. There's a transaction there. Uh, so it is it's its own sector, its own economy. The health, recreational health sector. Think of all the industries that it uh, includes. It's a massive thing in the U.S. I mean, I don't know if you ever heard of Academy Sports Outdoor. There's all sorts of stores that cater towards, sports and recreation, all the different sports that people play, baseball, softball, soccer, not soccer, not so much, or football, right? So So they're recreational, but they're not connected to labor. So I guess that makes it interesting. So it's like people that labor every day in the US, they often work hourly jobs or salary jobs, but then recreation is seen as something separate, treated as something separate.
And you would have to pay for the recreation.
You
Because when
must
I was
pay.
looking for like soccer team to play with, and on Facebook you can see a lot of like those advertised where you pay $5 per game or something like that, right?
Yeah,
And but then luckily, I mean, at Hopkins, I mean, they have these pickup games,
yeah,
with basically, they do it on the university property, and a lot of those people playing there are students, over at Hopkins, so which means that, you don't have to pay to use it.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
so I mean, so that was one way to go about it. I mean, I did the same thing in Princeton. They had the graduate FC. That was, great team to
But
be part
students
of.
usually pay that through their tuition fees, right? sports access or facilities. I think is that part in the fees some way. When I went to
Student
school, there was a
activity
fee
fee.
that like you had to pay to use the building, and then you could use the gym. I don't know how it was in your school.
Well, when I was a graduate student, you remember as a graduate student, you're an employee of the university, right?
Oh yeah, that's right.
So basically they pay you, right? So I mean, even if there was a student activity fee, I mean, like, I didn't see it in my pay stub, right? Any deductions.
All right.
Um
Okay.
so I think it would be the undergraduates probably that would foot the bill, right? More or less. Um yeah, so but it's good to have, physical outdoor activities. But ideally, you wanted to make it as uncommoditized as possible, right? Um,
Decommodified one.
yeah, the decommodified experience. Um, yeah, I think that's kind of the best form of resistance, really. I mean, I think Eric Olin Wright talks about it right before he passed away, right? Which is this concept of eroding capitalism. I think that's how he described it, right? This idea
Oh,
that
that's an essay. Yeah.
it is. It was about basically using, you know, like building, layering on alternative institutions, right?
Yeah. Wasn't
Um,
like taming capitalism, reforming
it was
it.
taming, eroding,
Yeah, it was
uh,
four. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I had to
smashing.
remember that. Yeah, smashing. Yeah,
Um,
but he was more for taming, right? You thought taming was more realistic or something?
yeah, so
Taming.
taming would be social democracy, right?
Okay.
And then the erosion would be through basically non-commodified institutions, right? So he likes UBI, and he likes the peer-to-peer economy, right? Where anything where I'm like, so it's not like couch surfing, for instance, right? So I wouldn't charge you to be, to stay over at my place, and then in that way, I build up, credit on my account, so that when I go couch surfing in another country, I can do that for free.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Um, so yeah, building up those, you know, personalized. Well, it's a little bit depersonalized too. I mean, couch surfing is somewhat depersonalized, right? But it's a way of providing goods and services to other people without charging them. Um, and it's kind of like, a goodwill based system. I mean, hoping that, like, I mean, there's going to be some kind of karma, right, which
Hmm.
balances everything out eventually, hopefully. Um, but generally, I mean, if you contributed a little bit more to the pool than you drew from it, I think there are psychological studies that show the internal satisfaction, the pleasure
Yeah.
that people get from
It's
that.
like a mutual aid kind of network. Yeah, that could assist and help. Yeah, yeah.
That's right. Yeah, that's kind of the core of this
Isn't that
theory
like
of
co-op
populism.
housing too, or co-op grocery stores, similar kind of setup? But it's of course they're profit entities. They want to make profit. But I like when I was in New York, I saw these co-op grocery stores. They're not so big in the South here, but like they're partly employee owned, and they sort of do their own thing, but they charge a little higher prices sometimes. But there's like kickbacks for the employees or something. They're like, no, co-op grocery stores in
And
your
what about the
neighborhood.
shoppers? I mean, I thought the
Okay.
shoppers, they would also be members, right? Um,
Well, no, but the employees own the grocery store, so it's like a co-op food store. Whereas if you have just a corporation, like I don't know what grocery chain you have up in Baltimore.
Giant. That's the main one.
Yeah, they're like big retail box stores where they're massive stores, but some of the grocery chains, they're co-op that like they're owned by members of the community, and then there's also kind of uh, it trickled down back to the employees. It's like more flat, I guess. That's the idea. So yeah, yeah. But we had a long discussion, I think.
Okay. All right.
Starting to
Yeah. So
mumble. That means I'm
we'll,
not.
we'll go then call it
Yeah, we'll
to an
call it.
end.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
then thank you very much, Mike, for
Yeah,
joining
yeah,
me
yeah.
on this podcast.
No, of